Chapter 21:20. It was not an easy task to teach a disciple who had no foundation in knife skills, or was completely led astray. Fortunately, Mara had a good understanding and was very motivated. Plus, Meg had a golden finger to help her. After an afternoon of practice, Mara was able to cut potatoes into thin slices of uniform size. Not bad. I'll give you this cleaver. Practice your cutting skills at home when you have time. Meg nodded with satisfaction at the sight of Mara slowly but steadily slicing a potato. Really? Master, this knife is for me? Mara looked at Meg with surprise. Although this kitchen knife was square, it was much better than the one she had at home. After spending an afternoon with Meg, Mara had already changed her address to Master after getting Meg's approval. Of course. Meg nodded with a smile. Let's call it a day. We'll go back after dinner. Mara nodded. After thinking for a while, she hesitated and said, Then, my Miss Effie? She doesn't know how to cook. Mara nodded. Then you go and ask her to come over for dinner. Meg smiled. He also remembered that he was busy teaching Mara at noon and forgot to ask Effie to recommend waiters. Okay, thank you, Master. Mara smiled and put all the potato slices into a basin. Master said that they could be used to make mashed potatoes and potato cakes. Are you going to ask Mara to cook dishes with wine in the future? Irina looked at Mara, who trotted out, and turned to Meg, who was wearing an apron and preparing to cook. Yes, this child is very talented in cooking and is very enthusiastic. I'm going to teach her to cook a few dishes with wine to maintain the competitiveness of Saipan Tavern. Meg nodded. However, he was directly poaching Effie's staff. Whether he could succeed or not depended on Effie's attitude. He couldn't do it by force. Miss, Master asked me to call you to dinner. Mara ran back to the tavern and shouted loudly. Before she saw anyone, she smelled a burnt smell coming from the kitchen, accompanied by smoke. Is it on fire? Miss, are you all right? Mara rushed to the kitchen and kicked the kitchen door open. Then she saw Eiffel with a spatula in his hand and a face full of soot. His eyes were red from the smoke as he turned around. Inside the pot, there was a black, indescribable object that was emitting scorched smoke. Mara was stunned. She coughed a few times as she choked on the smoke. Only then did she come back to her senses. She hurriedly ran to the water tank at the side and scooped a spoonful of water into the pot to cool down the indescribable object that had been burned to ashes. She then opened the kitchen window to let the smoke out. After doing all this, Mara pulled Effie out of the kitchen and looked at Effie with a puzzled expression. Miss, what's wrong with you? Could it be that you want to burn charcoal by yourself? Go to hell. Effie's face flushed red. Fortunately, there was a layer of soot on the outside, so it couldn't be seen. He turned his head away and lowered his voice. I just wanted to cook. From the looks of it, it doesn't look like you were cooking. If I came back a little later, the neighbors would have rushed in to put out the fire. Mara shook her head seriously. If I say so, then so be it. Effie waved the spatula in his hand and looked at Mara. You learned how to cook? Mara pulled out a kitchen knife with a whoosh. What are you doing? Rebelling? Effie looked at the knife in Mara's hand and then looked at the spatula in his hand. He became a little unconfident. No, this is the kitchen knife that Master gave me. Mara smiled and shook her head. She even waved it in the air. It's very useful. Effie was a little surprised. Master? Mr. Hades accepted you as his disciple? Yes, Mr. Hades agreed to let me call him Master. Today is the first time I learned that a kitchen knife can be used like this. Mara nodded with a face full of happiness. Effie's face was full of envy, but he still curled his lips and said, Isn't it just cooking? I can do it too. You are setting fire. Mara corrected him. Damn girl, your wings have hardened. Effie raised the spatula in his hand. No, my miss is the best. Master told me to call miss to eat. Let's go wash our face and change our clothes first. Mara quickly said, Did Mr. Hades specially tell you to call me to eat? Effie's movements stopped and there was a bit of joy in his eyes. No, I was worried that you would be hungry at home, so I specially told Master. Mara shook her head honestly. Effie snorted, but she still put down the spatula in her hand and went upstairs to change her clothes and wash her face. Ify changed her clothes, washed her face, and put on some light makeup before bringing Mara to Saipan Tavern. During dinner, Meg looked at Ify and asked, "Miss Ify, we are new here and we want to recruit a few waiters, but we haven't found any suitable candidates. Do you know anyone? Mr. Hades wants to recruit waiters?" Ify looked at Meg and understood after thinking for a moment. Saipan Tavern's business was booming now, and Mr. Hades' family obviously couldn't handle it alone. The Titan Tavern had 8 waiters, and she felt a little overwhelmed these 2 days, so she planned to recruit 2 more waiters. "What kind of waiters do you want to recruit? How much is the salary?" Ify asked. "They have to be nimble and generous, and it would be best if they are slightly younger. In terms of salary, it should be about 5,000 copper coins a month. Of course, if they are good enough, you can increase it," Meg said. Mag didn't expect to be able to wait for service staff to come knocking on his door like he did in Chaos City. He just wanted to be able to use them immediately. Ify pondered for a moment and said, "I do know a few of them. How about this? Are you free tomorrow afternoon? I can ask them to come to your tavern, and you can talk to them in person." "Thank you very much." Meg's eyes lit up. He had found the right person. After dinner, Ify and Mara bade farewell, and it was time for the Titan Tavern to open for business. After exiting the Saipan Tavern, Mara looked at Ify with a puzzled expression and asked, "Young mistress, didn't you make an appointment with those waiters yourself?" Ify shook her head with a smile and said, "Mr. Hades has more manpower than us. He has helped us so much, so this is nothing." Mara nodded. After thinking for a while, she said, "In that case, I will go and help Master." Ify turned to look at Mara with a hint of a smile and said, "Why? You want to run away from me so soon?" No pop-up window. Chapter 21-21. Titan Tavern was robbed by thugs and its owner, Ify, was kidnapped. After a night of terror, the news spread in the tavern circle. Fortunately, after the Titan Tavern closed for a day, it immediately resumed business. The lady boss's complexion also looked good, which made the drinkers breathe a sigh of relief. "It's good that Miss Ify is fine. I didn't sleep the night before when I heard the news. I was worried that something might have happened to you." Marcus looked at Ify with relief. "I'm sorry to have worried you, President." Ify smiled and poured wine for the organizers of the Wine Association. Fergus said indignantly, "Boris is such a scumbag. To think that we thought he was promoting the development of the winemaking industry and gave him the Silver Award." The others at the same table had similar expressions. When the news that Boris was the murderer spread, everyone did not quite believe it. It was not until several of Boris's taverns were closed and the news of his suicide was confirmed that the news spread in the circle. Ify's background was pitiful enough. Her parents died in a robbery. Boris did not hesitate to hire thugs to do the same thing to Ify in order to seize the Titan liquor formula and let the nightmare repeat itself. Fortunately, Ify was blessed by the heavens and turned the misfortune into a blessing. The murderer was punished. Ify smiled and drank a glass of wine with everyone before she went to work. She knew that it was not because she was blessed by the heavens, but because she happened to meet Mr. Hades. After the opening hours, Meg cleared the last few customers out. He was about to close the door when he saw she standing outside. Meg looked at her and thought for a while before saying, "Do you want to come in for a drink?" She's answer was still cold and straightforward. She walked past Meg and entered the tavern. Irina had already cleaned up the tavern with magic, and Amy had fallen asleep on the chair behind the counter with Ugly Duckling in her arms. Annie had just taken out her paintbrush and sketchbook from under the counter and was about to start her work for the night. "She wants to drink some wine," Meg explained to Irina. "What would you like to drink?" Irina looked at she and asked. She was like a lady boss serving customers. "Mautai," she said. Irina took a bottle of Mautai from the wine cabinet and gently waved her hand before it landed on the table in front of she. "Thank you." She sat down and said, but her eyes fell on Anne. Annie subconsciously hugged the sketchbook in her arms tightly. She was instinctively afraid. "Anne, go upstairs and draw first, but you have to go to bed early tonight," Meg took a step forward and blocked She's line of sight. He smiled and said to Anne. Annie nodded obediently and ran upstairs with the sketchbook and brushes in her arms. What would you like to order? Meg turned to look at She and asked with a smile. He knew that she meant no harm to Anne. Otherwise, she would not have given him the ring. Judging from the current situation, the Ancient One had yet to show up to take and away, so his impression of She was still at the guest stage. Moreover, she had saved their lives back in the ice field, so it was only right for them to make a few dishes to go with the wine. She glanced at the menu on the wall and said calmly, I'll take all of them. That's an adult's willful words. Meg raised his eyebrows but did not reject AI Faye's request. He was ready to go into the kitchen to cook. She's voice rang again. Meg stopped and was a little surprised by She's calm tone. For the first time, there was a strange fluctuation in his voice. She still looked indifferent and said, Red braised pork. Do you know how to make it? Red braised pork? I do. Meg nodded and looked at She strangely. It seemed that Anne's comic skills were good enough to make She mention red braised pork. She's eyes showed a hint of surprise, but she quickly hid it. She pondered for a while and said, Then add a helping of red braised pork. Red braised pork? That'll take a while, Meg said. Red braised pork was not difficult to make, but it needed time to stew slowly. It was not a dish that could be served casually. It's okay. I have time, she said calmly. But I want to sleep. Meg frowned. She was stunned and looked at Meg. This guy wants to reject me? How about this? Give me a battleship in exchange for a helping of red braised pork, Meg said in a negotiating tone. Impossible, she said coldly without thinking. This human was delusional. He wanted to use a portion of food to exchange for the most advanced battleship of the ancients. Then a main cannon is fine too. The one that repelled Cthulhu in one shot. Meg lowered his request. She just looked at him quietly and did not even bother to say a word. I don't want an electromagnetic cannon. Even a normal main cannon will do. Meg did not want to give up. After all, this was a reward that the system would not give him. The technological level of the ancients was far beyond the Norland continent and Earth. Any main cannon would be a direct combat force against the undead army. You're a human knight and she's a sorcerer. Even if you get the main cannon, you won't be able to use it, she said. Then you're underestimating me. Isn't it just a cannon? Who are you looking down on? Meg pursed his lips. Irina rolled her eyes and blushed. No one knew what she was thinking. I've said that the existence of the ancients must be hidden from others. Do you think it's reasonable for a battleship's main cannon to appear in this world? She looked at Meg and asked. Meg said seriously, any powerful attack made by the powerhouses is reasonable. At most, I'll carry it on my shoulder as a personal weapon. That's very reasonable. She frowned as if she could not imagine that scene. The undead army is a lifeless existence. They have no fear or fear of death. However, even if the various races of the Norland continent form an alliance, the warriors who go to the north to stop the undead army from going south have families behind them. If they die on the battlefield, it won't be a simple number, but a broken family. Possible, I want to increase the strength of the alliance. Even if it's just killing more undead, maybe the alliance will have fewer warriors dying, Meg said seriously. She looked at Meg with respect for the first time, but she still said coldly, I want to taste it first and see if the braised pork is worth a main cannon. Okay, please wait a moment. Meg's eyes lit up as he turned and walked into the kitchen. When she nodded, he knew there was a chance for the main cannon tonight. He wanted a powerful single combat weapon, but he also needed a tempting bait. I was persuaded by him? She frowned and felt like she had stepped into a trap. Are you a god? Irina sat down in front of her and looked into her eyes. Chapter 21-22. She looked at Irina. She was a young and beautiful elf with astonishing talent. She had already reached the pinnacle of power on the Norland continent. Among all the major races on the Norland continent, she had the best impression of the elves. They were beautiful, kind-hearted, and yearned for freedom. They had a high affinity with nature and were very cohesive. Yes, this was a record left behind by the observer more than 100 years ago. After her observation during this period of time, the truth did not seem to be so. The wind forest, which was known as the last pure land on the Norland continent, was a mess. The inferior hierarchy of humans prevailed among the elves. She even saw elven slaves who were ordered around like cattle. These experiences overturned her impression of the elves. She pitied the elves who were treated as slaves, but her good impression of this race was almost gone. This beautiful elf in front of her did not belong to the oppressed elven class. She should be a ruling class existence. I'm not a god. She shook her head slightly. Are you here to save this world? Irina continued to ask. That day on the ice field, that huge glowing object had launched an attack that shocked her. Even Cthulhu was forced to retreat. I'm not here to save the world. I have no obligation to do so. She still shook her head. You should know that I'm his wife, so I know everything. Irina smiled and crossed one leg. Since your target is also Cthulhu, then you're here to save the world. Only the truly powerful can save the world. We can't. Meg, who was cutting pork in the kitchen, was enraptured. When it came to flattery, Irina was indeed better than him. She heard Irina's words and frowned slightly as if she was in deep thought. This is your business, she said. Irina shook her head with a smile. No, the fact that you're here and have contact and cooperation with us, which you think of as inferior beings, means that this is not just our business. She sat up slightly and looked at the elf in front of her seriously for the first time. Irina stopped smiling and said in a low voice, You may have come from the heavens, or you may have come from the earth. It doesn't matter to us, just like those gods who leave traces but will never truly appear. What we want is a world where we can survive, even if this world has boundaries and limits. So, we can continue to stay in this world that isn't too rich, but you have to let us live, even if it's just to reseal those guys. She looked at Irina in silence for a long time before saying, I'm the limit of what the Ancient One can do for this world, and I have to make sure that I don't expose the existence of the Ancient One. According to the requirements, you shouldn't be in this world anymore, or you shouldn't have this memory and this conversation. If you are the limit of the Ancient Ones, then you can only choose to cooperate with us. Irina leaned back in her chair and smiled. I admit that you're my only choice. She nodded. She re-evaluated Irina in her heart. Talking to this woman was more oppressive than talking to Meg. However, this also meant that they were indeed good partners. She did not like to work with fools. If the Ancient One can't send people, perhaps you can provide weapons and rearm the various races of the Norland continent. Let us fight a proxy war against Cthulhu and the devils, Meg said to she as he came out of the kitchen with a few cold dishes. Proxy war? She frowned. This was a new term for her. However, Meg had already explained in advance that the Ancient One could provide weapons to arm the various races of the Norland continent. This is not a decision I can make. She shook her head. Meg said with a serious face, I hope that the Ancient One can assess the risk of the various races of the Norland continent giving up resistance and eventually becoming the devil's servants. You should know that a temporary alliance is not reliable. Moreover, there is a deep hatred between them. I will pass on your suggestion. She looked at Meg and nodded. Please enjoy. Meg put down the dishes and helped she open the lid of the mouth. He did not have high hopes for she's promise. After all, this was indeed not a decision she could make. As for what kind of position the Norland continent had in the hearts of the Ancient One, he could only test it out. She drank and ate in silence. Irina took a wine glass for herself, poured a glass of wine, and sat opposite her to drink. Mag glanced at Irina and wanted to say something, but stopped himself. After 3 glasses, Irina started to get drunk. She squinted at she and asked with a smile, What is the life of the Ancient One like? Do you have to eat, sleep, and beat Lil P? Who is Lil P? Why do you beat him? She put down her chopsticks and asked Irina seriously. It's Lil P. Everyone beats him, so we beat him, Irina said with a smile. We don't beat Lil P over there. She shook her head. They did eat and sleep, but it seemed that they lacked an interesting sport. Then do you fly when you go out? Irina asked again. Or do you use the teleportation portal? We choose the means of transportation depending on the distance, but the teleportation portal has been eliminated. Meg listened to the conversation between the two women in the kitchen and could not help but marvel at how women could talk about anything, even if one of them was drunk. He knew that Irina was most likely trying to get she drunk and get her to talk. However, she was someone who could walk out of the tavern on her own after drinking a bottle of Mautai and a bottle of whiskey. With Irina's alcohol tolerance of 3 glasses, there was no way they could compete with her. Not long after, she looked at the drunk Irina who was lying on the table and calmly eating drunkard's peanuts. At this moment, a strong meaty aroma wafted from the kitchen. "It smells so good." She stopped what she was doing and looked in the direction of the kitchen in surprise. This rich meaty aroma was so tempting that she could not help but swallow her saliva. This was an aroma that was beyond her knowledge. It was also an aroma that she had never smelled in the underground city. Only Buddha Jumps Over the Wall could compare to this. However, compared to the aroma of Buddha Jumps Over the Wall that was intertwined with various delicacies, this aroma was pure. It was the aroma of meat. She had already imagined the scene of braised pork being cooked in a pot to a bright red color. At this moment, she was like a mermaid who had just woken up from her bed and was attracted by the sudden aroma. So the picture album wasn't a lie? She picked up the glass and took a sip to calm her nerves. She could not help but look forward to it. Chapter 21-23. After simmering for an hour, the red braised pork was finally ready to be cooked. She, who had finished 2 bottles of wine, stretched her neck and looked in the direction of the kitchen. She eagerly watched Meg walk out with a bowl of red braised pork. "Your red braised pork?" Meg put down the bowl in his hand. The red and shiny red braised pork trembled and looked even more tempting. "Thank you." She thanked him, but her eyes were fixed on the red braised pork in front of her. It was the first time in her life that she was so eager for food. The cube-shaped red braised pork looked almost the same as in the picture album. However, compared to the picture, the red braised pork in front of her was more impactful. The oil shimmered under the light and the tempting meat aroma in the air. She opened her mouth slightly and swallowed. Her expression was exactly the same as the Little Mermaid in the picture album when she saw the red braised pork for the first time. "Isn't there a bowl of rice?" She looked up at Meg and asked. Meg was slightly stunned and could not help but laugh. "You're quite strict." In the picture album, in addition to a bowl of red braised pork, there was also a bowl of rice on the table. Red braised pork was not a dish that went well with wine. No matter how well it was made, it would still be greasy. However, with a bowl of white rice, it was complete. She was not in a hurry to eat because in the picture album, the Little Mermaid ate the red braised pork soup with rice. It looked much more delicious than the red braised pork alone. Soon, Meg came out with a bowl of rice. It was also a new rice that he cooked when he stewed the red braised pork. "Thank you." She took the bowl and thanked Meg. She picked up the chopsticks and was ready to eat. "Wait a minute. We just said that if you're satisfied with this red braised pork, you'll give me a main cannon. Is that okay with you?" Meg looked at she and said. She looked at Meg and then at the red braised pork in front of her. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Okay, please enjoy." Meg put away the tray and took 2 steps back. She picked up her chopsticks and picked up a piece of braised pork. The wild boar meat had been cut into long cubes. The thick gravy had dyed the wild boar meat a deep red. The fat and lean meat was soft and springy to the touch. This human's knife skills are really amazing. She looked at the equilateral pieces of meat with admiration. Even the angle was almost the same. She then put the meat into her mouth. The soft wild boar meat almost melted in his mouth. The lean meat was crisp and tough, dry but not dry. The skin of the meat was smooth and tender but sticky. The bite was almost non-existent. With a light bite, the fragrant and sweet gravy overflowed from the meat. The deliciousness of the wild boar meat was perfectly unleashed at this moment. It was fatty but not greasy, fragrant, sweet, and soft. This smell. She's eyes widened as if a giant black boar had suddenly crashed into her heart. The feeling of running around was just like the feeling of her heart racing. His taste buds were cheering, and his body was trembling with excitement. The feeling of joy from the deliciousness was so strong, our lips parted slightly, and she couldn't help but let out a soft moan. It was too wonderful. This feeling was exhilarating and also made him feel blessed. However, she quickly realized her gaffe. Her face blushed a little as she picked up the bowl in front of her and ate a mouthful of rice. The soft rice had the fragrance of new rice. The more she chewed, the sweeter it became. It perfectly took away the greasy feeling of eating the red braised pork. It was simply there for the red braised pork. She understood now. The picture album was real. Even she couldn't resist such delicious red braised pork, let alone the little mermaid who was ignorant of the world. Marrying a prince who could make delicious braised pork didn't seem to be an unimaginable thing. This was not a story of love at first sight, but a story of being tempted by delicious food. Thinking about it this way, the story became much more reasonable. The little mermaid must be desperate at the thought of not being able to eat such delicious red braised pork in the future and seeing the chef she reserved for a lifetime being snatched away. She couldn't help but put another piece of red braised pork into her mouth. Feeling the deliciousness on the tip of her tongue, she couldn't hide the smile on her face. The bowl of rice was soon empty, but there were still a few pieces of red braised pork in the bowl. She didn't even have time to eat the soup that she had been longing for. Just when she was hesitating whether to ask Meg for another bowl of rice, Meg had already placed a new bowl of rice in front of her and put a spoon in the bowl of red braised pork. She looked up at Meg and had a good impression of this human for the first time. At least when it came to food, he was indeed very understanding. Meg smiled. If it weren't for the main cannon, he would have hugged his wife and slept on the hot brick bed. Who would wait on her here? Soon, she finished another bowl of red braised pork soup with rice. Burp. She covered her mouth and burped. This feeling of satisfaction was simply too comfortable. Thank you for your hospitality. The red braised pork is delicious. She looked at Meg and said seriously, "Thank you." Meg nodded slightly and still looked at she with a smile. She wiped her lips with a tissue before she got up and walked towards the door. She then said in a cold voice, "I'll leave the main cannon on the mountain 100 miles north of Rodu. You'd better move it away tonight." "Thank you," Mag said again as he watched she's figure disappear at the door. He thanked her sincerely. After carrying the drunk Irina and the sleeping Amy upstairs, Meg activated the tavern's array and went straight out. The purple-striped griffin landed on a mountain 50 kilometers north of Rodu. A 100-meter-long giant cannon was erected on the top of the mountain like a pillar supporting the sky. Impressive! Meg rode on AZ and circled around twice before landing on the mountain. Next to this giant cannon were 4 boxes of shells, a total of 24 shells. This should be a miracle in the history of trade, right? Meg reached out and stroked this terrifying steel beast. He actually exchanged a bowl of red braised pork and 2 bowls of rice for it. He hoped that future generations would not mark this trade as a fraud. That day on the icy plains, Meg saw the firepower of Shi's warship with his own eyes. The firepower of this main cannon was already more than that of a 10th-tier magic caster. Moreover, the shells left behind by Shi were all cluster bombs, which were more suitable for destroying large groups of targets. Good, very good. If you come again next time, let's treat her to something delicious. Meg nodded. He was very satisfied with Shi. Meg put away the giant cannon and shells in the spatial ring and jumped back onto the griffin's back. He looked to the north and hesitated for a moment before ordering AZ to head north. Now that he had the cannon, it was time for him to find a position. Ending the war outside the Roth Empire's borders was the best promise to the civilians. Chapter 21-24. Meg walked around the outskirts of the ice field and didn't find any traces of the undead army for now. However, he saw many spies from the Roth Empire entering and leaving the ice field. He could tell that Andre had started to treat this matter seriously when it concerned the survival of the Empire. Meg chose a few locations and marked them on the map before returning to Rodu. He wasn't sure what Cthulhu was thinking about now, but before the Allied army formed and headed north, the undead army didn't show any signs of heading south. That was the best news for now. And the day after tomorrow, All the races would hold a meeting in Chaos City to re-sign the peace treaty and establish a new alliance to resist Cthulhu and the undead army together. Connie is surprisingly capable. Meg received the latest news from the orcs early the next morning. The Fok tribe had taken over the August tribe, and the orcs who had been divided for many years were united. They elected the chief of the Fok tribe, Connie, as their chief. Meg was a little dazed. That timid young girl back then had become the queen of the Twilight Forest in the blink of an eye. Was the woman from yesterday drunk? Irina took the water from Meg and finished it in one gulp. She was still a little dazed from the hangover as she asked Meg. She was a little drunk too. Meg nodded. He didn't want to tell Irina that she had drunk 2 bottles of wine, eaten a set of red braised pork, and 2 bowls of rice before leaving happily. That would be too cruel. As expected, Irina immediately perked up after hearing that. She proudly said, "Heh, I knew she couldn't hold her liquor well. Connie is already the queen of the Twilight Forest now." Meg passed the letter to Irina with a smile. "There's such a thing?" Irina received the letter with surprise. She scanned through it hastily, and smilingly said, "It's quite surprising. She actually killed Oster with her own hands. Her master is the hairless monk after all. It's still understandable for her to kill Oster who lost an arm." Meg nodded. Meg then took out the map and discussed with Irina the few locations he chose in the north last night. "System, where's my reward for finding the snails yesterday? Why haven't you sent it to me yet?" "I'm almost done with my snacks," Amy complained in her heart as she lay in bed. Although young mistress found an edible snail yesterday, you asked her parents, so the system's mission is not considered completed. The system said carefully. "You didn't say I couldn't ask for help. Now you're using this excuse to say no. I'm not going to play with you anymore. You can live by yourself in the future." Amy got up from the bed and went downstairs in a huff of baby. It might become the first host in history to be abandoned by the system, and the reason was actually because of a snack gift bag reward? There's no other way. Looks like I have to ask the seniors for help. Amy went downstairs and ate 3 soup dumplings in a row, a bowl of congee with pork and century egg, and a bowl of sweet tofu pudding before she felt less angry. Amy found an edible snail yesterday. What did the wishing well reward Amy with? Meg looked at Amy and teased her. He didn't need to think too much to know that the little fellow had probably exchanged it for a snack gift bag. Amy got angry at the mention of it. She put her hands on her hips and said angrily, "That's stupid wishing well. I'm going to ignore it. Stupid, 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 stupid." "What's wrong? It didn't give you a reward?" Meg asked with a smile. "Anyway, I'm just going to ignore it. I'll go and fill up the well in a while," Amy said seriously. "Okay, Father will help you fill it up in a while." Meg nodded. It looked like the system needed to be taught a lesson. "Little mistress, I was wrong. I know I was wrong. Please take care of me." The system's humble voice sounded in Amy's mind. But Amy wasn't moved at all. After breakfast, Meg found a shovel in the tool warehouse and looked like he was really going to accompany Amy to fill up the well. System forum, help post. "Yes. I'm here again. What if I'm blocked by Little Mistress? Urgent. Add, and now Little Mistress and her father want to fill me up. Help." Reply, strongest strategy guide system. This system is probably an idiot, right? Learning God system. The system is an existence of information flow. It doesn't have a physical body. What kind of form did your host use to fill you up? Or did we create a physical system recently? Bootlicker system. I told you the host would rely on bootlickers, but you didn't listen. In the end, you'll have everything you want. God of cookery cultivation system. Embarrassing. It's too embarrassing. A system like me buries its host at the drop of a hat. How can I be threatened by a system? Great villain system. Moderator, can you pull this guy upstairs into a small black room? Otherwise, I'll ask my host to kill his host. God of cookery cultivation system replied to great villain system. Come over. == convex prompt. God of cookery cultivation system has been muted for 7 days due to provocative emoticons. Meg and Amy came to the backyard, each holding a shovel. Irina and Anne stood at the door and looked at the two of them with confusion. They didn't know how the well provoked the father and daughter so early in the morning. "Rest in peace," Amy said solemnly as she scooped up a shovel of soil with a small shovel. Then she was about to pour the soil into the well. Then a miraculous scene appeared. Bags of snacks overflowed from the mouth of the well, and they kept gushing out. Amy stopped what she was doing and looked at the Mimi shrimp crackers that fell by her feet. Then she looked at the snacks that kept gushing out of the well, and her eyes lit up. "This is?" Irina and Anne looked at the scene with surprise. "You prepared this?" Irina looked at Meg and asked. "You could say so," Meg said with a smile. He planned to help Amy hide the secret of the system, including from Irina. "Wow, is this the new type of potato chip? Lime-flavored? I don't think I've eaten it before." Amy's shovel was nowhere to be found. In its place was a large bag of potato chips, which she had already torn open and started eating. As for the matter of filling the well, she had already thrown it to the back of her mind. "See, this little foodie is so easy to please. Little ancestor, are you satisfied now?" The system's voice sounded in Amy's mind. "Seeing that there are so many snacks, I'll forgive you for now." Amy ate the potato chips happily with a few bags in her arms. The system said, "Then I'll have to thank you, brother. This is all I can lend you. Remember to pay me back next month, 5 points. "Thank you, big brother. We're brothers in the same boat, so you have to take care of me in the future." "Bullshit. Who's your brother in the same boat? I've always been domineering and mean what I say to the host. You have to learn from me in the future, and be a system with principles and standpoints." Okay, the deal was over. Chapter 21-25. Meg nodded in satisfaction as he looked at the snacks that came out of the well. This meant that Amy's training had succeeded. She had become a beginner who could make the system bow down to her. "Help yourselves." "It's my treat," Amy said to the three of them as she hugged the chips, and took a pack of Snickers bars from the pile of snacks. She would sometimes feel hungry when she stayed up late to paint at night. She could wipe away her hunger and be herself again after eating a piece of this. Irina took a pack of way-long spicy strips. She usually didn't eat junk food. However, this spicy strip seemed to have some special magic. She had stolen a pack from Amy's snack gift bag previously. Oh, there was no such thing as stealing her daughter's snacks. She had taken it openly. Meg didn't like to eat snacks. He watched as Amy kept all the snacks into the magic wand. After informing the three of them, he went out and placed a bamboo container under the locust tree at the entrance of the alley. The news about Cthulhu and the army of the dead had spread all over the Norland continent. Meg didn't choose to hide the news about Rankster after much consideration. Rankster was too strong. Even the current Meg didn't have absolute confidence in defeating him. If he hid such combat power, it would be a disaster for the allied army. He also didn't have a way to save Rankster from being controlled. Even if she intervened, she could only bring them out of the encirclement of Cthulhu and the army of the dead. Elizabeth had already left the restaurant. It was unknown if she already knew about this news. Meg knew very well what Rankster meant to Elizabeth. If she knew about this, she would definitely go to the polar ice field before the allied army fought with the army of the dead. This was what worried Meg the most. Rankster might still have a trace of consciousness left, but Cthulhu had absolute control over him in the polar ice field. Even if Elizabeth appeared in front of him, she wouldn't be able to make him recover. The bigger possibility was that she would be torn apart by the wandering army of the dead before she could see Ranks. Hence, he wanted to make use of Chaos City's intelligence network to find Elizabeth and stop her. "Are you worried about Elizabeth?" Irina asked softly when she saw Meg return with a heavy heart. Meg nodded and sighed softly. "Yes. If she appeared in the extreme northern ice field now, I'm afraid she would become like Rankst. She is very smart. I believe that she will not put herself in danger." Irina shook her head slightly. "I hope so. I have already asked Chaos City to help look for her. Her presence might make it easier for us to deal with Rankster during the final battle." Meg could only wait for news at the moment. He still had to return to Chaos City to attend the meeting tomorrow, so he hoped to get some good news. By the way, what's the situation in the Wind Forest? Given the current situation, do you have the confidence to take down the City of Life with me? Meg asked Irina. Previously, I had been wondering why Helena's attitude suddenly became gentle and even allowed the system that she had created to collapse. Now, it seems like she has taken a step back in order to advance. Irina shook her head. Currently, the chaos in the Wind Forest has gradually subsided, and the living conditions of the lower-class elves have improved to a certain extent. Although the elves who were originally nobles have lost some of their privileges, they still maintain their superior conditions in all aspects. The sharp class conflict has been resolved. The slaves at the lowest level have already left the forest, and the basic conditions for a large-scale rebellion have disappeared. Irina shook her head. Indeed, the older the ginger, the spicier it is. Meg also felt a little emotional. Helena seemed to have lowered her head and compromised on the surface, but she did not lose control of the elves, and used a gentle method to resolve the internal conflict. Once the lower-class elves accepted the current living conditions, Helena and the nobles could tighten their conditions at any time in the future, and they would not be able to resist. This rope was still in Helena's hands. Meg admitted that he and Irina were still too inexperienced when it came to playing politics. If it were his father, he might really be able to play games with sly old foxes like Helena and Andre. Actually, there was another way to regain control of the elves, and that was to kill Helena. However, in the current situation, not to mention whether the other races would sit by and watch Helena die, the elves would fall into chaos. Meg, who knew the strength of the undead army and Cthulhu best, would not do something like cutting off one of his own arms. Let's talk about it after this alliance war ends. Cthulhu and the undead army are our most important opponents now, Meg said. Okay. Irina nodded and said, but I plan to make a trip to the Wind Forest tomorrow to retrieve something. Okay. Meg nodded and did not ask any further. Golden Dragon Island, Golden Palace. Lewis looked at the seated golden dragons and asked, how is it? Have you found Elizabeth? Chief, we have searched all over the Norland continent, but we did not find Elizabeth. Jinx stood up and shook his head. The other giant dragons shook their heads as well. Where did this lass go? Lewis frowned. I wonder if the frost dragons are looking for her. She is a frost dragon, after all. Her kind might be able to sense her presence more easily. Jinx pondered and said, I'm afraid they didn't even look for her. All right, let's put this matter aside for now. As for tomorrow's meeting, the Dragon Island meeting has already come to a conclusion yesterday. Douglas and I will go as representatives. You guys stay on the Dragon Island and get ready to head north at any time. At the same time, in the Frost Dragon Tribe's Frost Palace, all the giant dragons gathered with solemn expressions. The third elder looked at Douglas and said, Great Elder, we still haven't found Elizabeth. However, there are already people waiting at the border of the polar ice plains. If she heads north, we should be able to stop her before she enters the ice plains. Where did this girl run off to? Douglas's brows were tightly knitted together. In my opinion, we don't have to bother about this damn lass. I have long known that Rankster is not a good person. He was in dire straits several times back then, but he could appear again. I thought he was lucky, but it turns out that he had already become the devil's puppet. Now, the dragons are all gossiping about us frost dragons. They say we released the devil, and they have to be wary of us betraying them during the battle, the second elder said angrily. All the elders present did not look too good either. There had been a lot of gossip on Dragon Island these few days. The Frost Dragon Tribe was indeed in a worrying situation. Shut up. Douglas glared at the second elder coldly. His terrifying aura even froze the air. Chapter 21-26. If Rankster had obtained his power by selling his soul to the devil back then, do you think you would still be able to stand here and make such sarcastic remarks today? Douglas said to the second elder coldly. The second elder choked and lowered his head in silence. I don't know why Rankster became the devil's puppet, but I don't think there's any problem with him becoming the chief. Moreover, I'm telling you now that Elizabeth is the hope of the Frost Dragon tribe. She's also our hope to continue to be one of the top 10 dragon tribes. If we lose her again, you might have to scram from this island. Because you don't have the ability to guard this place and keep trying to kill the person who can keep you here. Douglas' voice echoed in the hall. The expressions of the Frost Dragon elders changed slightly, but they had no choice but to remain silent in agreement. Fox was a good-for-nothing who couldn't be helped. If he became the chief, the Frost Dragon tribe would lose their status on Dragon Island even faster. Find her at all costs and bring her back, Douglas ordered coldly. Boundless Sea Realm, Demon Islands. On a foggy archipelago, an ancient gray castle stood by the seaside. As the ancestor of the vampires, I should have the right to remove you from your position, right? Dracula sat at the head of the table and swirled a crystal goblet filled with scarlet liquid in his hand as he smiled at Maynard, the chief of the vampires. The upper echelons of the vampires gathered in the castle hall, but the atmosphere was a little tense at this moment. The ancestor of the vampires, Dracula, had gathered them here today and said that he wanted to choose a new chief. Maynard had been the chief of the vampires for more than 100 years. After Dracula became the new ancestor, everyone thought that his position would become more secure. Unexpectedly, the first one to have ideas about him was Dracula. What was even more surprising was that the other ancestor was actually absent from today's meeting and clearly said that he wouldn't interfere with the result. This meant that Maynard's position as the chief was only up to Dracula's whim, and he could even appoint a new chief according to his wishes. At this moment, Camilla, who hadn't appeared on the island for a long time, was standing behind Dracula. It inevitably made people daydream. Previously, when Dracula obtained the ancestor's inheritance, it had a lot to do with Camilla being forced into marriage. Maynard's face darkened, but he still lowered his head and said respectfully, "Yes, this is the ancestor's right." Among the vampires, the vampire ancestor had absolute bloodline suppression over other vampires. This was also the reason why the ancestor had a transcendent status among the vampires. The patriarch could only be said to be the representative of the daily affairs of the clan. The final decision was in the hands of the primogenitor. Maynard had failed to sell his daughter for glory, and Dracula had even plucked the fruits of his labor. It was already tragic enough for him to become the ancestor of the vampires. Who would have thought that he would be stripped of his position as the head of the family today? There were also some vampires who had other ideas. Although the clan leader did not have as much authority as the two ancestors, the ancestors usually did not care about the clan's affairs. In fact, they were still the ones who controlled the vampires. If Maynard was removed from his position, who would become the new chief? Very good. It seems that after being the patriarch for so many years, Big Brother, you are still very familiar with our rules. Dracula smiled evilly, and his gaze swept across all the vampires present. Then, he said loudly, "Maynard's conduct is improper. From today onwards, he will be removed from his position as the clan leader, and Camilla will succeed him." Camilla? All the vampires' gazes landed on Camilla, and they were all shocked. Camilla was also shocked. Obviously, she did not know about Dracula's arrangement before this. "I'm afraid this arrangement is not very appropriate." Maynard looked at Dracula and Camilla with a sullen expression. Camilla is still a child, and she has never been involved in the clan's affairs. Now that we are in troubled times, I'm afraid that letting her take over the clan leader's affairs will affect the important matters. Many vampires nodded in agreement. Dracula swirled the red wine glass in his hand and looked at Maynard mockingly. "I'm afraid it's not appropriate for you to say that she's still a child now, right? You have to know that you have already forced her to marry in exchange for bargaining chips twice. Are you worthy of being a father to force a child to do such a thing?" Maynard's face alternated between green and red, and he was stunned speechless. "Uncle, you're amazing." Camilla looked at Dracula with stars in her eyes. In this lifetime, only he would protect her like this. As for that so-called father, perhaps from the moment she was born, he had only treated her as a bargaining chip that could be traded at any time. The other vampires could tell that this was a family matter, and they hurriedly shut their mouths. Maynard's power was gone, and Dracula was going to support Camilla to take over. Furthermore, he had obtained the approval of another ancestor. Camilla would be the next ruler of the vampires. Maynard took a deep breath and looked at Dracula. "You're fooling around. I don't believe that the Great Elder will agree with your decision." Since he didn't appear, it means that he has tacitly agreed with my decision. Dracula shook his head, took a sip of red wine, and looked at Maynard. "My dear brother, I'm no longer the younger brother that you can order around as you wish. I hope that the word fooling around will not appear in our conversations in the future." A terrifying aura appeared from Dracula's body. Maynard's face was filled with fear, and his legs trembled. He could not control himself and knelt on the ground. "Now, do you still have any objections?" Dracula restrained his aura, and he still had a mocking expression on his face. Maynard lowered his head, bit his lip, and said, "Yes, he was no longer the useless younger brother that he could control and mock as he wished. The absolute suppression in terms of bloodline and strength made it impossible for him to put up any resistance." Camilla looked at Maynard, who was kneeling on the ground, and felt a little carefree and a little sad. "Very good." Dracula nodded slightly, and then looked at all the vampires present. "Now, I announce that Camilla will be the new chief of the vampires. She will take up the position immediately." "Greetings, Chief." All the vampires bowed to Camilla. Camilla, who was still in a daze, hurriedly said, "Rise, rise." She did not expect it either. She thought that she was just coming back with Dracula to show off, but she did not expect that her father would be replaced as the chief for no reason. However, this feeling of returning, it was wonderful. Seeing Maynard lowering his head dejectedly and submitting to Camilla, she vented all the anger in her chest. There was a time when she did not want to step into this sea and this castle again, even if she had to wander around forever. But Dracula brought her back again, and he gave her the foundation to establish herself, as well as many other things. Chapter 21-27. In the Buffett Manor in Chaos City. In the brightly lit study, Miss Hill was reading through some documents. Her secretary walked in and looked at Miss Hill as she said, "Young mistress, the locomotive engineering department has been fully invested in cannon research and production. The engineers and workers are very enthusiastic." Miss Hill put down the documents in her hand and looked up at the secretary as she said, "Very good. Give all the engineers and workers a month's salary in advance and distribute it tomorrow according to the previous standard." This was a request from the City Lord's castle. Miss Hill was already aware of what had happened in the far northern glacial plains of the Roth Empire. This was a crisis that concerned the survival of all the races on the Norland continent. As a banker who saw the Norland continent as a market, she could see the opportunities lurking beneath the crisis. Tomorrow, all the races would gather in Chaos City to discuss important matters, and barring any mishaps, they would sign a new peace treaty on the spot. This meant that if the Norland continent could survive this crisis, then it would welcome another 100 years of peace. This was a very precious opportunity, and it concerned the survival of the Buffett family. As such, when she received the City Lord's castle's request, she didn't hesitate at all, and immediately ordered all of the engineers and craftsmen under her command to invest in cannon production. Perhaps she wouldn't be able to make any contributions on the front lines, but with the Buffett family's wealth, she would be able to do many things in the rear. "All right. Have you tested the power of those cannons?" Miss Hill asked curiously. The City Lord's castle didn't say who had made those cannons, but if City Lord Michael was so interested in them, then they had to be quite powerful. The secretary pulled out a piece of information from her bag and presented it to Miss Hill as she said, "The City Lord's castle just conducted a test today, and we received a report. The power of a small caliber cannon is equivalent to an explosive fireball released by a third-tier magic caster. The power of a medium caliber cannon is equivalent to an explosive fireball released by a fourth-tier magic caster, and the power of a super large caliber cannon is equivalent to an explosive fireball released by a sixth-tier magic caster. It can reach the power of a sixth-tier magic caster." Miss Hill was a little surprised. Even though super large caliber cannons were already considered metal behemoths, they were tools that could be used by normal people. This meant that as long as there were enough super large caliber cannons, they would have a group of 6th-tier magic casters. This designer is truly a terrifying genius, the Hill couldn't help but exclaim. She had seen the materials used for the cannons. Although they were rare, they were not expensive or precious. The goblins could provide them in large quantities. However, no one would have thought that when these seemingly incongruous things were put together, they would burst forth with such terrifying power. As for the cylindrical barrel, it gave the cannon the ability to launch long-range attacks. However, if such a weapon of mass destruction had appeared 100 years ago, the last racial war would have been even more terrifying. The designer had chosen to take out the cannons at such a time probably because he had seen that the various races had decided to sign a peace treaty and that it would be difficult for them to start another war within 100 years. This kind of foresight made Hill admire him from the bottom of his heart. Recruit more blacksmiths in Chaos City and double their wages. Get them to join the team that makes the cannons. Try to increase production, Hill said to his secretary. Okay. The secretary took the order and left quickly. Hill couldn't help but pace back and forth in the study. Troubled times, but they also contained great opportunities. If she could go with the flow and seize the opportunity, she might be able to establish a foundation as big as her grandfather's. Moraton Manor. Gloria listened to Geoffrey talk about the current situation of the Norland continent with a grave expression. She was silent for a while before she looked at Geoffrey and said, "Grandpa, I want to donate the cloth workshop and all the cotton yarn and cloth in my hands to prepare warm clothes for the soldiers who are going to the extreme north to resist the army of the dead." Geoffrey looked a little surprised, but it quickly turned into relief. He nodded with a smile and said, "The cloth workshop is already yours. You don't have to ask me for permission to make a decision." "But why are you doing this?" Gloria said with a serious expression, "Now that all the races are separated by a strip of water, we can only fight for a chance of survival if we unite as one. We can't go to the front line to kill the enemy, but we can do our part in the rear. Even if it's just to let the soldiers on the front line have warm clothes, it's better than doing nothing." Geoffrey nodded with relief. "That's right. This is a completely different crisis from the racial war 100 years ago, but it's also a rare moment when all the races on the Norland continent can unite as one to fight against the enemy. If we win, then the Norland continent may enter the next 100 years of prosperity and trigger the conditions for the integration of all the races. That would definitely be a great era full of imagination. For their generation, it was also the era that they wanted to see the most in their lifetime. However, this era was destined to belong to the young. Geoffrey looked at Gloria with appreciation. He wasn't worried about the legacy of the family Moraton at all now. In the next era, Gloria would leave behind her own legend. Meg didn't have to wait for too long before someone knocked on the door. "Coming." Meg stood up to open the door. There were 4 young and capable ladies standing outside. "Hello, are you here for an interview?" Meg asked the 4 ladies with a smile. "Yes, Boss Ev introduced us to you for an interview." The leader was a short-haired lady with a gentle smile. Meg stepped aside. "Please come in." The 4 ladies walked in. Judging from their aura and demeanor, they seemed to be experienced. They didn't seem to be restrained at all. They were calm and made people feel comfortable. "Please take a seat." Meg poured a glass of water for them, and then sat opposite the 4 ladies with Irina. They were sizing up the 4 ladies who came for an interview, and the 4 ladies were sizing up the young boss and his wife. They originally wanted to interview at the Titan Tavern. They heard that the Titan Tavern had recently won the gold medal at the wine tasting conference, and the tavern's business was booming. However, Miss Ev had recommended them to the Saipan Tavern across the street yesterday. It was said that the Saipan Tavern had also won the gold medal at the wine tasting conference. Furthermore, the tavern didn't have any employees. They were in need of manpower, so they offered a good salary. Meg spoke first. "I'm Hades, the owner of this Saipan Tavern. This is the lady boss. Can you introduce yourselves? It's best if you can tell us your work history separately." "I'm Jones, 18 years old this year. I've been a waiter in a tavern and restaurant for 5 years, and a small foreman for 1 year," the short-haired lady said first. Chapter 21-28. The resumes of the four girls were ordinary, they were just some waitresses with some experience, and all of them had worked in a tavern before. But this was also the standard of a normal waitress. How could there be so many princesses and queens for him to pick up? The good thing was that Effie had obviously chosen them. These four girls had good characters, they were all down-to-earth people. The advantage of being experienced was that they could start working immediately after being recruited. There was no need to train them slowly. Half an hour later, Meg looked at the four girls and said with a smile, "Very good, if you have no objections to the salary, you can come to work tonight." So fast? The girls were stunned for a moment. For a famous tavern like the Saipan Tavern, there were all kinds of requirements for waitresses. When they came, they didn't even have much hope. They didn't expect that they would all be hired. "Yes, this is the uniform. You can wear it before coming to work tonight. Take it back and try it on to see if it fits." Meg got up, took a few sets of red and black uniform from behind the counter, and gave them to the four girls. Meg had already thought it through. The requirements couldn't be too high. The waitresses just needed to be down-to-earth and hardworking. Everything else was secondary. The Saipan Tavern had already completed most of its historical role. The next thing he needed to do was to find someone who could take over the tavern. He was already prepared to leave everything to others. "Okay, thank you boss, we will work hard." Jones was the first to react. She took the uniform from Meg and said with a serious face, "Okay, thank you for your hard work." Meg nodded, looking at Jones with appreciation. He quite liked this girl. She had some natural leadership skills. She was a good candidate for management. The other three girls also took the uniform and thanked him. They couldn't hide the joy on their faces. The boss was very generous. At least the salary he gave was very generous. A base salary of 5,000 and a commission, according to the daily turnover of 100,000, their monthly salary might be over 10,000. This was something they didn't even dare to imagine. An ordinary waitress with a salary of 3,000 copper was already a very good salary. "By the way, Jones, stay for a moment. I have some questions I want to ask you alone," Meg said to Jones, who was about to leave. Jones said goodbye to his companions and returned to his seat. "I plan to make you the team leader. As a manager, your monthly salary will be 2,000 copper coins more than an ordinary waiter. However, you will be responsible for connecting everyone's work and maintaining the team's enthusiasm. Do you think you are qualified for this job?" Meg went straight to the point. Jones was a little surprised, but he reacted quickly. After thinking seriously for a while, he nodded solemnly and said, "Thank you for your trust, boss. I believe that I can do this job well." Meg nodded and said with a smile, "Okay, then come to the tavern an hour earlier this evening. I'll tell you the details of your job." Jones nodded and then left. "That's it?" After the girls left, Irina turned to look at Meg and asked, "I know they're not as exceptional as your elves, but they're the most exceptional waitresses in Rodu," Meg said with a resigned expression. He had gone to the talent market the other day and didn't even find any young girls, let alone experienced waitresses. Irina didn't say anything after hearing that. "Mr. Hades, are the girls satisfied?" Eiffel knocked on the door and asked with a smile. She had just seen the girls leave in high spirits upstairs, so she wanted to ask about Meg's recruitment. "If there's a need, I can find some new candidates for you." If this were anywhere else, Meg would definitely say, "Next batch." However, it clearly wasn't the right time. After all, his wife was sitting right next to him. "The girls are very good. Thank you for the trouble, Miss Eiffel. I've recruited all of them," Meg said with a smile. He was indeed very grateful to Eiffel. "I see. That's good." Eiffel was a little surprised that Meg had accepted all of them. She was gratified but also a little distressed. These were the most exceptional waitresses that she had found recently. They were very agile, had good morals, and were very easy to use. Meg looked at Eiffel and said, "By the way, there's one more thing that I want to discuss with Miss Eiffel. It's about Mara." "Mara?" Eiffel's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that Mr. Hades had really taken a liking to Mara? He had just accepted her as his disciple yesterday, and he wanted to take her away today? Meg explained, "It's like this. My wife and I don't care about fame and fortune, and we don't like crowds. Even though the Saipan Tavern has just started running, we're feeling a little tired. Hence, I want to find someone to take over the Saipan Tavern so that we can continue to travel the world. Eiffel faltered for a long while before coming to her senses. You're saying, you don't want to run the Saipan Tavern anymore? We're not planning to close it. We just want to find someone to take over the tavern so that we can wash our hands of it, Meg said with a smile. So, you didn't choose Mara, did you? A peculiar expression appeared on Eiffel's face. That girl, other than eating, there's nothing else in her mind. If you let her manage a tavern with such a booming business, it would collapse in a matter of minutes. Mr. Hades was a smart and steady person, so how could he make such a rash decision? Mara's cooking talent is good. I plan to teach her a few dishes that go with drinking, and then let her manage the tavern while I'm at it. Meg nodded, but, of course, this matter still depends on Miss Eiffel's attitude. After all, Mara grew up with you, so you're like her parent. Mara's temperament is good, she doesn't have any bad intentions. Eiffel shrugged and said a little helplessly, but because of this, her mind is quite simple. She's suitable to be a tool, such as brewing wine and cooking. But she's not suitable to be the manager of a tavern. This is completely beyond her ability. Then who do you think is the best candidate, Miss Eiffel? The Saipan Tavern is already one of the top taverns in Rodu. Business is booming, and there are all kinds of customers. We need a manager who's smooth and slick and can handle the situation, and such a candidate. Eiffel looked at Meg and Irina, who were both looking at her with smiles on their faces, and raised her eyebrows as she said, You don't want me to be the manager, do you? Miss Eiffel's abilities are outstanding, and her character is pure and kind. Furthermore, you've been managing taverns for many years, so you're indeed the best candidate, Meg said with a serious expression. But I still have the Titan Tavern to manage, Eiffel muttered to herself. Meg continued, I'll continue to recruit employees and draw up a work code. Miss Eiffel, you only need to be responsible for overall planning and management. If Miss Eiffel is willing to join us, I'll give you a share of the Saipan Tavern on the 3rd floor, and we'll be partners. Chapter 21-29. AI Faye's heart was filled with sadness and resistance as she looked at Meg. I like you so much, but you only treat me as a tool? So sad. Moreover, once she accepted this arrangement, it would mean that it would be difficult for her to see Mr. Hades and his family again. The only thing left between them was pure money. But under Meg's gentle and expectant gaze, the words of rejection that reached her mouth couldn't come out. She knew that she had fallen. If it was in the past, she would definitely say, Scumbag. Meg saw AI Faye's conflicted expression and said apologetically, I know this is a bit excessive, Miss AI Faye, please don't blame me. Just pretend that I didn't say anything. If he wasn't in a hurry to save the world, he wouldn't want to give up the tavern now. After all, he had to lead the charge to the north to fight with the undead army. I'll think about it. After all, this is not a small matter. AI Faye said with a smile. The conditions that Mr. Hades gave were actually very generous. With the current situation of the Saipan Tavern, she could get 20% of the shares just by managing it. Throwing away the emotional distractions, this was a huge sum of money. Okay. Meg nodded. The more serious AI Faye was, the more assured he would be to hand over the tavern to her. After all, it was a business worth tens of millions. It was impossible to just find someone else. AI Faye could be considered a veteran in this industry. She had been running the tavern alone for many years and had a lot of experience. As for Mara, just like AI Faye said, she was too simple-minded. Letting her manage the tavern was forcing her. Miss, are you here so early for a free meal? Mara carried a kitchen knife and rubbed her sleepy eyes as she came to the entrance of the tavern and whispered to AI Faye. You only know how to eat? AI Faye blushed and patted Mara's head. But we haven't had breakfast yet? Mara took a step back and looked at AI Faye with an aggrieved expression. I'm going to eat some soup, do you want to come? AI Faye smiled. Yes. Mara immediately nodded. She hadn't eaten for days and missed it. Master, I'll come back later, Mara said to Meg and left with AI Faye. Irina looked at AI Faye's back as she left. She looked at Meg with a smile and said, It seems like she's moved by you. There are millions of people who have fallen for me, but you're the only one in my heart. Meg looked at her seriously. Ah, glib tongue. Irina rolled her eyes at him, but she couldn't help but smile. Oh, women. Meg laughed in his heart. Since he had nothing to do in the morning, he took out the stack of information Fitch had given him. There was indeed no shortage of powerful veterans in the food and entertainment industry among the merchants who had provided the information as requested. However, forget about the medicine shop. What was with the coffin shop? You can't wait for them to drink themselves to death so that they can choose a good coffin and take it away, right? In addition, there were two other brothels that caught Meg's attention. This was an era where prostitution was legal. Brothels were legal entertainment places where men could vent their excess energy. Originally, there were a few brothels on Romo Street, but because the business atmosphere of the entire street had disappeared, the girls couldn't receive any customers and had scattered. Now that Romo Street was showing signs of taking off again, the brothels had set their sights on this area. Judging from the price of the Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern, the customers who came to drink had enough spending power and were very good customers. Do all men like this? Irina, who was passing by, glanced at the information in Meg's hands and stopped in her tracks. No, those are all vulgar men. A good man like me is very family-oriented. Meg said righteously, then threw the two brothels' information in his hands into the trash can. Making money isn't shameful. Irina smiled. The main thing is that these two are too inferior. Meg shook his head. Do you know where to find a better one? Heaven on earth. Meg glanced at Irina, whose gaze was gradually becoming dangerous, and changed the topic. How can it be better than home? A man's gas station should be a warm home. I have to make a trip back to Chaos City to settle the Night Elves matter. You and the children can go back tomorrow. Irina didn't want to talk too much with Meg. All right. Be careful on the way back. Meg nodded. He also knew that there were many things for Irina to settle with the Night Elves. Irina left with magic, and Meg took out the two pieces of paper from the trash can and placed them at the bottom. To build a business street with all kinds of food, drink, and entertainment, it was very important to have a comprehensive ecology. With the tavern as the core, other aspects were also indispensable. However, Meg wasn't in a hurry. There were more and more businessmen coming to look at the shops during non-business hours, so he didn't have to worry about not being able to rent out the shops. He just had to consider who to choose. This opera troupe is quite interesting. Seems like they don't have much money. I wonder how capable they are. Meg looked at the application for the Black Cat Opera Troupe mixed in with the information. They wanted the shop in the corner to build an opera house, but the price was very low. However, the interesting thing was that there was a small line of words written in the corner of the application. This is all the money we have, please. There was also a little black cat's imprint. This price was definitely not attractive to ordinary people. Moreover, compared to brothels, opera houses were less attractive to men. However, Meg was a little curious about this opera troupe. Even in Rodu, opera was considered a new performing art. There were very few opera troupes. Meg and his family had gone to watch an opera a while ago. It cost 50 copper coins for the ticket, but it was boring. The wailing and howling of the singing and the dancing that didn't have any sense of beauty had already driven away most of the customers halfway through the performance. However, this Black Cat Song troupe stated in the application that they were a rather capable opera troupe. However, they were currently in a difficult situation because they lacked a fixed performance venue. Then I'd like to see if you're worthy of this shop. Meg took out the piece of paper and put the other information under the counter. Then he said to Amy and, do you want to watch the Black Cat Song troupe's performance? Is it Caesar? Amy's eyes lit up as she asked curiously. Ugly Duckling was also a little excited when it heard this name. Caesar was Camilla's cat. Meg shook his head with a smile. No, it's an opera troupe. Amy was enlightened. Then she asked, then do I have to bring a small blanket? The young ladies in the opera troupe sing are very good to sleep with. Meg glanced at her. The opera singer wanted to hit him. I think we can bring 3 beds, Meg said with a smile. After packing up, Meg brought the 2 little fellows out. Chapter 2130. Meg took the two little ones and wandered around the complicated alleys in the south of the city for more than an hour. After making several locals dizzy, they finally found the Black Cat Opera House in a place that was completely different from the one on the application. Rather than an opera house, it was more like a rundown farmhouse. There was a white sign hanging on the windy wooden door. The words Black Cat Opera House were written in delicate black charcoal handwriting, and there was a black kitten drawn at the end. In fact, they had just passed by here in a carriage. But Meg could not connect the opera house with the rundown yard in front of him. The last time they went to see an opera, it cost 50 copper coins, and the venue was quite decent. It can't be here, right? There doesn't seem to be anyone here. Amy whispered to the windy door to take a look. There are people here, and quite a few of them. Meg smiled. Although there was no one selling tickets at the door, there were more than a dozen people in the yard. If they were all from the opera house, they could be considered a small opera troupe. Then are we still going to watch? They don't seem to be performing. Amy asked. This was also what Meg was hesitating about. After searching for so long, he would not be satisfied if he went back without watching. But looking at the other party's posture, Meg suspected that these people were scammers and not opera troupes. I'm very sorry, troop leader Pascal. Our Black Cat Song troupe has encountered some difficulties, but we still plan to continue performing opera. We have no intention of merging with your Marca opera troupe. Please go back. Just as Meg and the others were about to leave, a gentle and moving voice sounded from the door. Marca opera troupe? Why does this name sound so familiar? Meg raised his eyebrows slightly. Is it the opera troupe that sings and sleeps so well? Amy asked. Yes, that's it. Meg nodded. He had slept so well last time that he did not even remember the name of the opera troupe. Listening to this conversation, it seemed that the troupe leader of the opera troupe had come to the Black Cat Song troupe to merge with them. This proved that the Black Cat Opera troupe did have a certain level of strength. Troupe leader Vicky, I know you are a sentimental person, but you and I both know the Black Cat Song troupe's current situation. Even survival is a problem, let alone a theater and stage. If this goes on, the Black Cat Song troupe will be completely disbanded. As long as you sign this contract, the Black Cat Opera troupe and Marca opera troupe will merge. We will be a family in the future. I have already found a financial backer. He is willing to fund us to build a big theater. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The middle-aged man's voice said earnestly. There was a moment of silence. All of a sudden, an unruly and irritable voice rang out, You fat and greasy fatty. How many times do I have to say it for you to understand? You think your street monkey troupe is worthy of being called an opera troupe? Don't think that you can call it an opera just by standing on stage and screaming. The reputation of opera has been ruined by you. Get the hell out of here right now. Otherwise, I'll personally cut you up. I think you need to be taught a lesson. A series of banging sounds came from inside the door, accompanied by a few muffled groans. The rotten wooden door was knocked open with a bang, and a fat man with blood all over his face staggered out. He mumbled a few words and then rolled and crawled away. Inside the door stood a petite girl in a black Lolita dress. She had her hands on her hips, and her green hair stood up like a little lioness. Outside the door, Meg and his daughter stared at her with their mouths agape. The decaying wooden door swayed in the cold wind before finally collapsing to the ground. As for the girl inside the door, her green hair slowly fell to the ground. Her red eyes, which were shining with a fierce light, gradually became clear and bright. Her imposing manner was greatly reduced. Sigh. The girl looked at the middle-aged fat man's disappearing figure with a vexed expression. Then her gaze landed on the three people standing at the door. She suddenly realized something and her face turned red. She smiled at them awkwardly and said in a gentle voice, Sorry, did I scare you? That gentle tone, that gentle voice, and that natural and unpretentious attitude. She was completely like a cute big sister, okay? Although she was less than 1.5 meters tall and had an A rating, she was still unrivaled in her cuteness. It was impossible to associate her with the lion-like, middle-aged fat man who was 1.9 meters tall and the domineering female group leader who defended her dreams and career. Is this acting? I love it. Meg couldn't help but look at the girl in front of him in a new light. The perfect combination of the irascible queen and the gentle big sister. Normal men couldn't understand this kind of beauty. We're here to watch the opera. Meg pointed at the plaque that had fallen to the ground. Oh, Vicky was shocked. She hurriedly pulled the plaque out from under the door and patted the dust off it like it was a treasure. Only then did she come back to her senses and look at Meg. You said, you're here to watch the opera? Meg looked at Vicky, who was holding the plaque like it was a treasure, and nodded with a smile. We're in the right place, right? Of course. This is the Black Cat Song Troupe. Vicky nodded quickly with a smile on her face. However, she looked at the door lying on the ground and said a little embarrassedly, just now. It was a little unexpected, but our performance definitely won't disappoint you. I hope so. Meg nodded and followed Vicky into the dilapidated farmyard. The yard was very desolate, but it was very clean. A small wooden platform was put together in the middle of the yard, and it looked very shabby. In front of the wooden platform, there were a few shabby chairs, and there were also signs of poor maintenance. This should be the so-called Black Cat Open-Air Theater. Please take a seat. The opera is about to start. Vicky's face was slightly red as she led the three of them to their seats. This was the first wave of guests who didn't immediately turn around and leave after entering the theater in half a month. A few young heads popped out from the side of the room and looked at Meg and his father with curiosity and excitement, as if they were opera performers. You don't have to take care of us. Meg glanced at the legs of the chair that were tied up with strips of cloth and was a little worried that they wouldn't be able to withstand his slightly forceful expression. Amy had already taken out her folding stool, and as a consumable, she very cleverly learned from her mother and prepared a few more. Therefore, Meg and also sat down on the safety of their own stool. Vicky's expression was slightly awkward, but she was also quite excited. At least there were guests sitting down, which was a good sign. Please wait a moment. Vicky quickly walked toward the actors' lounge. This leader doesn't seem very smart. Isn't she going to take away the tickets first? Meg looked at Vicky's back and frowned slightly. Chapter 2131. Leader, are these three people here to listen to the opera? This is the first time someone has sat down in half a month, isn't it? That's great. Our Black Cat Song Troupe's chance to shine and make a name for ourselves is here. As soon as Vicky walked in, the opera troupe members gathered around her excitedly. During this period of time, they had been treated coldly like never before. Their enthusiasm was almost wiped out by the cold wind and loneliness outside. All right, everyone, get ready to perform on stage. This kind of opportunity doesn't come by every day. If this performance is successful, maybe this guest will bring us new guests. Vicky could not hide the excitement on her face. Leader, have you collected the tickets? At this moment, an old voice suddenly sounded from the corner. The smiles on everyone's faces froze, and they all looked at Vicky. Vicky's expression also stiffened. She looked a little embarrassed and blushed. Shaking her head, she said, "Not yet." Sigh, everyone sighed. It seemed that this was not the first time something like this had happened. Leader, we haven't had any income for half a month. If this goes on, everyone will really starve to death. A troupe member looked at Vicky helplessly and said, "Rumble." Someone's stomach made a series of sounds in response. Everyone could not hide the worry on their faces. That's enough. Shut up all of you. Vicky's aura suddenly changed. Her red eyes swept across the crowd like a king examining his subjects. She said in a low voice, "A good opera singer will never worry about food. As long as you perform well and show your strength and state, no one will be short of the ticket price, unless they don't want to step out of this courtyard." Everyone immediately fell silent and began to prepare to go on stage. Meg and the two little guys were sitting in the courtyard in the bitterly cold wind. They had already taken out small blankets and wrapped themselves in them. The small blankets finally came in handy, but they did not expect that this time it was not for sleeping, but to keep out the cold. Even for an amateur like Meg, it was the first time that he had participated in an open-air opera that had its own bench and blankets. When the actors of the Black Cat Song troupe came out one after another, they were all stunned when they saw the three people sitting on small chairs, wrapped in small blankets, and warming themselves by a fire. A little weird and a little cute? Especially the two little girls, one big and one small, who were wrapped in a small blanket and stuck out their small heads. They looked exquisite and cute, and their silly and adorable looks were simply too adorable. Ahem. Vicky coughed lightly, reminding her team members to act more professionally. It had been too long since he had seen the audience, so the audience seemed to be more curious. This made him seem unprofessional. The actors hurriedly retracted their gazes and went up the stage one after another. They began their performance. Meg glanced around. This was a small opera troupe with only 16 people. There were 3 musicians and there were actors of all ages. They all looked sallow and emaciated, and their steps were unsteady. It seemed that it was not easy to be an artist. The opera was called Miss Black Cat. The troupe was called the Black Cat Song Troupe, and the play was called Miss Black Cat. For a small opera troupe that had just started, it was quite smart. If the opera became popular, their opera troupe would also take off. Hacker. The performance began. Without the accompaniment of a large band, the atmosphere was slightly lacking. But to Meg's surprise, this opera troupe's performance was actually quite good. Their sallow and emaciated appearance did not cover up their solid singing and acting skills. Their rich and melodious voices were far beyond the limitations of the wasteland stage. Miss Black Cat told the story of a young lady from a big family. In order to break free from the shackles of the world, she kept fighting and finally left the big family. She gained freedom and a new life, and finally, she gained love and a career. It was a very cliché and simple story, but the performance of the opera actors was full of tension and could really arouse the emotions of the audience. What surprised Meg the most was the actress of Miss Black Cat, Vicky. This petite troupe leader had a shocking soprano, and her control of her voice was amazing. She was several levels above the other actors. He finally understood why Vicky was able to become the troupe leader. She had outstanding strength, excellent acting skills, and was able to attack and defend. Ordinary people could not beat her. The two little ones were also watching with great interest. Although they were wrapped in a small blanket and warmed by the fire, they did not feel sleepy at all. "Father, what song is Miss Black Cat singing? Why can't I understand it?" Amy asked curiously. At this moment, Vicky was singing a low and sad song in a language that Meg had never heard before. Meg listened carefully for a while. The system did not translate any useful words, but he vaguely felt that the tone was a little familiar. "I don't know. Maybe it's a dialect from somewhere." Meg shook his head slightly. Although the language was incomprehensible, emotions could be conveyed through singing. This Miss Black Cat opera, under the passionate performance of Vicky and the other actors, achieved an effect that far exceeded Meg's expectations. Vicky's professionalism had even surpassed the lead actors of several operas that Meg had seen in his previous life. She was definitely at the level of a professional opera actor. But opera was still in its infancy in this world. How could there be such an outstanding opera troupe leader? Could it be that she was a legendary genius? Or was she a transmigrator like him? Meg's curiosity was successfully piqued. The performance ended. Meg, Amy, and stood up and applauded to show their appreciation for the opera performance. And wiped the corners of her eyes. It was obvious that the little one liked the story very much. "Thank you." Vicky bowed to the curtain call with the actors. From their faces, it was obvious that they were in a very good mood. To be able to receive the applause and appreciation of the audience was a great honor for an opera actor. It was also their motivation to persevere. "Can I draw this story?" And turned to look at Meg and gestured with her hands. "We need to ask Miss Black Cat's opinion. After all, this is her story." Meg smiled as he looked at Vicky, who was walking towards them. "I can help you ask her later." And nodded. The performance was very exciting. Your voice was very memorable and unforgettable. Meg looked at Vicky with a smile. It was not flattery, but Meg's feelings after watching the performance. Of course, this is the best opera performance on the Norland continent. Vicky raised her chin slightly like a proud little lion. There was a hint of arrogance in her red eyes. It is your honor to be able to hear such a performance. Meg looked at her. Although her words were crude, they were not crude, but it was still a little inappropriate to say such things to the few guests. Vicky lowered her head, and the red light in her eyes faded. She looked up at Meg, who had a strange expression on his face. Her expression changed slightly, and she waved her hands awkwardly. I'm sorry. She must have said something rude to you. I mean, thank you for watching. The tickets? Forget about the tickets? Chapter 2132. This young lady's sudden change in attitude caught Meg off guard. And he grasped a key piece of information. Was it the sheet that Vicky mentioned? Who was she? Who is she? He originally thought that Vicky was using her acting skills to protect herself, but now it seemed that this was not the case. This change might not be an act, but another soul that existed in her body. This became interesting. Combined with his previous guess, could it be that when a modern singer transmigrated, she did not succeed in occupying the whole body, but shared the same body with the original owner, thus causing the split state? It was a very interesting guess. Meg looked at Vicky with great interest and shook his head with a smile. After seeing such a wonderful performance, of course I have to give you a ticket. Vicky's eyes lit up. She looked up at Meg and could not help but show an expectant look. Their opera troupe had run out of food, and now the only valuable thing left in the troupe was the set of clothes she was wearing. But this was the only set of clothes she had. It was not only her daily clothes, but also Miss Black Cat's costume. If they sold this set of clothes, it was basically announcing that the Black Cat song troupe would be disbanded on the spot. But if this audience member could give them the ticket money, even if it was only 10 copper coins, they could buy some rice to make porridge, which could at least last for a few more days. The troupe members were also looking at them from not far away. When they heard that the head of the troupe was going to waive the ticket money, everyone's heart sank, but now it was lifted again. This audience member seems to be quite rich. He should be able to give at least 10 copper coins, right? Wow, look at his 2 little babies. They are so adorable. He should at least give 20 copper coins. I say, you are too unambitious. This is the first batch of guests who have finished watching our performance in half a month. He can't walk out of this door without 30 copper coins. Then I want to eat more rice for my porridge tonight. The opera performers were whispering to each other, wondering how much Meg would give for the ticket. My child likes your opera very much. She asked if she could draw the story of Miss Black Cat into a picture book. Meg was not in a hurry to pay. Instead, he looked at Anne and said, "Draw it into a picture book?" Vicky thought for a while and looked at Meg. Are you going to draw it for fun? Or do you want to publish it? Wow, that's a very professional question. Meg was increasingly certain that this girl was not an ordinary person. Her copyright awareness had far surpassed most people in this era. I'll consider it. Meg nodded. Vicky looked at Meg and said, Miss Black Cat's story was written by me. If this little sister wants to publish it as a picture book, I need to see her work first. Once I'm sure it meets my expectations, we can discuss how to split the profits. You may not understand, but Miss Black Cat's story is very important to me, and it took me a lot of effort. I hope you can understand, Vicky explained in a gentle tone. I can understand. Meg nodded. This is the money for our tickets today. The opera was wonderful. I hope to see you perform again in the future. Meg took out 3 silver coins and handed them to Vicky and a piece of paper. This is my address. Such a good performance shouldn't be trapped in a place like this. If you're interested, you can come to me. I can provide a better environment for you. This? Vicky looked at the 3 silver coins in her hand. She was surprised at first, but she hesitated when she heard Meg's words. Don't worry. I just like your performance, and the decision is in your hands. Meg took Anne and Amy's hands, nodded slightly at the actors standing not far away, and then walked out of the door. By the way, the next time you come, maybe and we'll have drawn Miss Black Cat's story. You can confirm if it meets your expectations. Meg looked back at Vicky and then left. Vicky held the 3 silver coins and the piece of paper in her hand and stood there for a long time without moving. After a while, the actors of the troupe gathered around and looked at Vicky. They wanted to say something, but they didn't. "Beanbox, what are you waiting for? This is 3 silver coins." Vicky came back to her senses and looked at the actors with disdain. "Tonight, we're eating meat." "Meat?" Everyone cheered. They had been starving for the past few days, and their eyes lit up when they heard about meat. "Idiot, take the money and buy 3 pounds of meat, 10 pounds of rice, and some vegetables." Vicky took out a silver coin and gave it to a middle-aged man who looked quite honest. The man took the money like it was a treasure and quickly walked away. Vicky turned back into her room and opened the piece of paper. There was only one address on it, Romo Street, Saipan Tavern. She was very familiar with this address. A month ago, it was still a desolate scene. She also wanted to settle down there, but the money in her pocket didn't allow her to. 2 days ago, she went there again and was surprised to find that the flow of people on that street had skyrocketed. After asking a few people, she found out that it was because the 2 taverns had won the gold medal at the wine tasting conference, and Romo Street was about to take off. She was now regretting. If her wallet had been a little better, the Black Cat Song Troupe would have been on the shortcut to take off. But she still wrote an application and filled in a rent that she couldn't afford. She wanted to make a last attempt. And now, the audience was ready to give her a chance. Although she didn't know where the performance venue was and what other conditions he had arranged for them, it would definitely be better than this rundown yard. And, if she remembered correctly, this tavern was one of the taverns that had won the gold medal. That man was rich. "What do you think?" Vicky suddenly asked. "Isn't it just going to talk? If you're afraid, then I'll go." Vicky asked and answered her own question. "I'm afraid you'll fight with them." "I'm not afraid. What are you afraid of? Every time you can't beat them, I'll go." "I'm really afraid. Father, the opera was so good. Are we coming again next time?" After leaving the yard, Amy looked up at Meg and asked expectantly. If Amy likes it, we'll come again next time." Meg nodded with a smile. Other than eating, the little one had a rare interest in something. "Then can I draw Miss Black Cat?" and gestured in sign language. "And if you want to draw it, you can. But we can't print it and sell it before we get the authorization from Head Vicky." Meg nodded with a smile and was ready to teach the little one some knowledge about copyright. The Black Cat Song Troupe's performance completely exceeded his expectations, so he planned to give them a chance to perform in a more professional venue. And this would become a very important part of the ecology of Romo Street, even more important than the Saipan Tavern and the Titan Tavern. It was still worth looking forward to. Chapter 2133. System. Can you analyze the language the troupe leader sang just now? Meg asked in his heart as he sat in the carriage that stopped him. While Vicky's singing was stunning, Meg was even more curious about her identity. The system gave him the language pack of all the races on the Norland continent so that he could understand all the dialects without any hindrance. However, he could not understand the lyrics Vicky sang. Of course, it was normal not to understand some of the words. For example, the yodelers? After listening to it, you could only exclaim, "Fuck." However, Vicky's singing was not in this sequence. Her tone was low and her emotions were sad. There must be something to it. The language is not in the system's language library. It cannot be searched or translated directly. It is not a language commonly used on the Norland continent, the system replied quickly. Meg muttered, "Then do you think she's a transmigrator or from a hidden race? Or perhaps, like they came out from underground? 50% hidden race, 30% transmigrator, 10% from the underground world, and 10% unknown." The system gave an analysis report, 50% transmigrator, 10% hidden race, 30% from the underground world, and 10% unknown. This was his deduction. From her awareness of copyright, Meg believed that she was not from a hidden race like Noah and the others. She must have lived in a place with a higher level of copyright protection. The ancients had a very high level of technology, so there must be a corresponding copyright protection system. If she was a transmigrator, then it would make sense that she had problems with the language, as well as her opera skills that exceeded the standards of the Norland continent. Of course, she should not be from Earth. This girl is definitely not simple. Meg was thinking about which building to convert into an opera house. With the Black Cat Song Troupe's current situation, it was difficult to even eat, let alone pay the 50,000 copper coins rent. Adhering to the concept of value investment, Meg had decided that if Vicky came to him, he would build an opera house for them, but at the same time, he would receive part of the opera troupe's profits in exchange. With Vicky's ability and the completion of Miss Black Cat's opera, he was very confident that this opera troupe would be popular and profitable. Mr. Bobby, I'm sorry to inform you that the Black Cat Song Troupe has rejected our merger invitation, and that damned woman even tore my face apart. Pascal covered his bloody face with an angry expression. The young man standing in front of him shook his head and said, I sympathize with your experience, but Vicky is a gentle girl. You shouldn't frame her like this. Pascal felt wronged. You didn't see how crazy she was. She's like a lioness. Bobby took out a bag of silver coins and handed it to Pascal. He said indifferently, this is your reward. Send a part of it to the Black Cat Song Troupe. They're in a difficult situation now, but they have many excellent actors. You know there aren't many opportunities like this. Pascal took the money bag and opened it. His eyes lit up and his expression immediately became much more respectful. He nodded and said with a flattering smile, I know. I'll go to the Black Cat Song Troupe again soon and let most of them become members of our Marca Song Troupe. Remember, you can make the Black Cat Song Troupe sink deeper into the mire, but you can't hurt Miss Vicky. She's mine. Bobby looked at Pascal with a hint of warning. I know. Pascal put away the money and respectfully watched Bobby get into the car and leave. He muttered, oh, I don't know what's so good about that woman. She has no figure and a terrible temper. He's willing to spend so much money on her. In the afternoon, Meg taught Mara how to cook drunkard's peanuts. This was a relatively simple dish, but it was still quite a challenge for Mara. Meg demonstrated and taught her step by step. Finally, he used his golden finger to guide her. In the end, it took Mara an entire afternoon to grasp the basics of how to cook drunkard's peanuts. Next, it's time to practice. When you get home, find some time to practice and master this dish as soon as possible. Meg grabbed a few slightly charred peanuts in the bowl and threw one into his mouth. He couldn't control the heat very well, so it already tasted a little strange. Mara nodded vigorously, her little face full of excitement. This was the first dish she learned from her master. Although it wasn't perfect, she felt that she had learned a lot. But master, is this really peanuts made by a drunkard? Mara couldn't help but ask the question that had been in her heart for the whole afternoon. She didn't think her master was a drunkard. Why did he have such a strange name? No, this is a peanut that will turn people into drunkards if they eat it. Meg shook his head with a smile. Because it goes well with alcohol. Oh, I see. Mara was enlightened. It was a little different from what she had imagined. By the way, Mara, we're going out tomorrow. Maybe we'll be gone for a few days. If a girl in a black dress comes looking for me, help me pass this to her, and then take her to room 101. Meg passed a brown paper bag to Mara. What's her name? Mara took the paper bag. Her name is Vicky. Okay, I'll remember it. I'll keep an eye here. Mara nodded seriously. Meg didn't ask Mara to stay for dinner. After all, she still had a hungry Effie waiting for her to go back and cook dinner. Amy hugged Ugly Duckling and went up to Meg. She looked up and asked, if we're going back tomorrow, shouldn't we bring some gifts back for the sisters? Yes, if Amy hadn't mentioned it, I would have forgotten. Meg nodded with a smile. Speaking of which, they had been away for 2 weeks. It was time to bring some gifts back for the girls. In the evening, the 4 new employees arrived early. Meg arranged their work. Jones, who had experience as a cashier, would be in charge of the most important cashier's work. The other 3 girls would be in charge of taking orders, serving drinks, and cleaning the table. The addition of the new employees made Meg's work much easier. However, when the evening business ended, Jones looked at her exhausted colleagues and couldn't help but whisper to Meg, "Boss, maybe we need more colleagues." The business of the Saipan Tavern had far exceeded their expectations. It was also not comparable to the taverns they had worked in before. It was too difficult for 4 waiters to run such a tavern. Even if they were experienced, they would often make mistakes. "Yes, I'll continue to look for more candidates." Meg nodded. He had also noticed this problem. His mentality was still a little out of Amy's mode. He always thought that one employee could do a lot of work. This was a little too much for ordinary waiters. Chapter 2134. After the operating hours, Meg brought the 2 children back to Chaos City via the flying restaurant overnight. The flying restaurant shrunk and stopped at Mamie's balcony. The spiral staircase was lowered, and Meg carried Amy, who was already asleep, down, and followed behind with her sketchbook. Recently, the little fellow was obsessed with creating and refused to sleep until 11 or 12. "Why did you come back overnight?" Irina walked out of the room and looked at Meg in surprise. "I couldn't sleep well without you," Meg said with a smile. Irina rolled her eyes at him. He was the one who really couldn't sleep well tonight. "And go to sleep after you finish this page?" Meg stared at Anne and settled the 2 children down. "Take a shower first. You reek of smoke and alcohol." Irina raised her hand to stop Meg from leaning forward. Together, Meg took a hot shower. After exercising for a while, he lay on the big round bed and stretched comfortably. Speaking of which, Mamie's was indeed the most comfortable place to stay. "Is there a problem with the night elves?" Meg asked Irina, who was leaning on his chest. "Nothing." Irina panted slightly. "I talked to Michael, and we plan to participate in tomorrow's meeting in the name of the night elves." "I'm afraid that old witch Helena is going to flare up," Meg said with a smile. He could already imagine Helena's expression. This is no longer something she can decide. "At least, I'm not representing the elves," Irina said nonchalantly. "However, since we're going to form an alliance and form an allied army, we have to choose a leader to command the allied army. What do you think about this?" Irina looked up at Meg with a serious expression. Meg thought carefully for a while, then shook his head and said, "At present, there seems to be no one who can convince the masses. Even the dragons can't choose a leader, let alone the allied forces of the major races. If that's the case, I'm afraid that even if we form an alliance, we'll still be in a state of disunity," Irina said worriedly. Meg nodded with a solemn expression. They were facing Cthulhu and an undead army that was fearless and resolute in carrying out orders. If they were in a state of disunity, they would have no chance of winning this war. There were always conflicts of interest between the various races, and there were even grudges that were difficult to resolve. It was already extremely benevolent of them not to stab each other in the back. At this time, if there weren't strict rules for the various races to fight together, and if there wasn't a strong commander who could convince the masses, this battle would have been lost from the beginning. "I think the only candidate is you." Irina looked at Meg with a burning gaze. "Me? There's no one more suitable than you now." Irina nodded. Be it luring the lightning to battle Cthulhu outside of Chaos City, or becoming a free person after breaking off ties with the Roth Empire, and having sufficient strength and charisma, you're the most suitable candidates. "Is it really as good as you say?" Meg stroked his chin, and really thought about it seriously. "Actually, this is also something that Michael mentioned to me today. If the Allied forces are in a state of disunity, this war will definitely be a disaster." Irina looked into Meg's eyes, and nodded with certainty. "Now, the Norland continent needs you." Meg really fell into deep thought now. It wasn't that he was afraid, but he was worried that his ability wasn't enough to lead such a large-scale war, not to mention such a complicated situation. Even the experience that Alex left for him was limited to the small-scale wars with the orcs at the borders. "Let's play." However, looking at Irina's encouraging and expectant gaze, and the current stalemate, he really couldn't bring himself to reject her. They really didn't have a choice. "All right, I'll stand up." Meg nodded. Irina smiled, and pressed her red lips against his again. Again? The next morning, Meg asked Amy to go to the dormitory to call Yabamiya and the rest over for breakfast. Meanwhile, he prepared a huge table of breakfast early in the morning. "Boss, you're finally back," Yabamiya said in surprise as she walked in with Amy in her arms, and looked at Meg, who was still busy in the kitchen. Angela followed them in and excitedly said, "A familiar smell. Is the life of having a delicious breakfast starting again?" "Boss," and Jane greeted them with a smile. Hannah came in with a bottle of wine and waved it at Meg as she said, "Boss, my wine is ready to leave the factory. Do you want to try it?" "It's early in the morning, so I won't be drinking." Meg came out of the kitchen with a row of steamers, took the wine from Hannah's hand, and placed it on the counter. He didn't doubt Hannah's winemaking skills at all. Since she was sure that the wine was ready to leave the factory, it must be good wine. It seemed that the wine market was going to welcome a new barbarian, a barbarian who could sell large quantities of wine and maintain high quality. "What's this? It's round and looks so cute. Is this a new breakfast you created?" Yabamiya asked curiously as she looked at the soup dumplings in the steamer. Everyone's attention was also attracted by the stack of steamers. "These are soup dumplings. Father recently made them for breakfast. They're super delicious." Amy climbed onto her personal high stool, took a plate, and reached out to pick up a soup dumpling. "I'll teach you how to eat it." Meg placed a steamer in front of everyone with 3 soup dumplings as the core of the breakfast. Everyone watched as Amy picked up the soup dumpling and placed it on their plates shakily. Only then did they feel relieved. Then, they saw her take a small bite on the side of the dumpling, sipping the soup in small mouthfuls. Finally, she finished the dumpling with the filling. This seemingly ritualistic process caused everyone to stare in a daze. "Have you all learned it?" Amy asked everyone as she licked the oil on her sweet lips. "I really don't know what to do with you all." "Then I'll demonstrate it again." Before anyone could answer, the little girl had already skillfully picked up the second soup dumpling and continued to teach them seriously. Everyone smiled and followed Amy's example. They carefully picked up a soup dumpling and placed it on their plates. Then they took small bites while it was still warm. "These soup dumplings are too delicious. We can drink soup, eat meat, and eat the skin. It's perfect." Yabamiya couldn't help but exclaim after finishing a soup dumpling. "But the soup is so hot. I feel like I can't feel my tongue." Hannah stuck out her tongue with a sad expression. "This is the tongue of a million winemakers. You have to cherish it," Angela reminded Hannah, who had just finished a soup dumpling elegantly. "I can chill it for you." Amy smiled and reached out her hand. A ball of cold flame slowly rose. "I'm done." Hannah immediately retracted her tongue and shook her head in refusal. Chapter 2135. Breakfast ended on a happy note. As for the question of Meg's return and the reopening of the restaurant, Meg gave a negative answer. "We're back this time to rest for 2 days. After that, we'll set off for our next destination." Meg smiled and said, "Therefore, the restaurant won't reopen for business for the time being. We'll follow the original plan and rest for a month." "Boss, you don't know how much the customers miss you. There are dozens of people who come to the ice cream shop every day to ask when the restaurant will reopen," Yabamiya said bitterly. "Yeah, there are even perverts blocking the entrance of our dormitory." Hannah nodded and said sadly, "I thought they were lusting after our beauty. I didn't expect them to just want to eat your food. Isn't that too much?" Meg smiled and listened to the girls talk about the interesting things that happened between him and the customers. He was a little surprised that Mamie's had such a special place in the hearts of the customers. He thought that the restaurant was just a place to eat. If this one didn't reopen, there would be another one. He didn't expect that so many people would stay at his place and not leave. It's not just the regulars. Recently, there have been many customers who came from other places. I heard that they came after reading a magazine called Total Food and Beauty. When they saw that the restaurant was closed, they could only leave in disappointment. Yabamiya looked at Meg and said, "I've seen that magazine before. It was written by you, boss." "There are people who came directly to the restaurant?" Meg was even more surprised. They came for a magazine. He had underestimated the determination of these foodies. Yabamiya nodded and said, "Yeah, so you've really decided not to reopen for business for the next 2 days? Even if it's just for 2 days, it will bring some comfort to the customers. Forget it. They've just gotten used to living without me. If they lose me again, it will only make them more miserable." Meg smiled and shook his head. The main thing was, he had to save the world. If the world was gone, foodies wouldn't even have the chance to eat. Meg chatted with everyone for a while. He looked at the time and found an excuse to leave. The interracial conference was about to begin. Meg naturally couldn't miss such an occasion. In Chaos City, the various representatives had already taken their seats at the round table in the conference hall. The organizer of this meeting, the City Lord of Chaos City, Michael, was sitting in the middle as the host of this meeting. The representatives of the giant dragons were Lewis and Douglas. The Golden Dragon Tribe and the Frost Dragon Tribe had buried the hatchet. Recently, the Golden Dragon Tribe had gained a lot of prestige and support from the Dragon Tribe. They had obtained the right to represent the giant dragons at the Dragon Tribe Convention. The elves sent Helena and Sally. As the new princess of the elven race, Sally's performance was becoming more and more mature. She had also broken through to the 8th tier, so she could be considered one of the best among the younger generation. The orc race was rather eye-catching. Connie had already become the only queen of the Twilight Forest. This was a scene that had not appeared in the orc race for hundreds of years. The hairless monk was sitting beside her, just like the #1 bald guardian. No one dared to underestimate this pair of master and disciple. The king of the dwarves had arrived personally and was talking to the lord of the gnomes in a low voice. The topic was related to cannons. The demon race's representative team was still a little chaotic. The top 10 demon races had all sent their representatives, but they had not reached a consensus internally. And the most eye-catching one was the new chief of the vampires, Camilla. No one would have thought that the vampires would suddenly change their chief at such a time, even though it was considered a harmonious transition. The new chief of the forest trolls sat obediently. After being taught a lesson by Meg, she had no temper to speak of. On Lanta's side, the high priest, Dexter, and the king had already arrived. It was enough to show how important this meeting was to them. Quick, as Lanta's power was gradually revealed, they had already become the overlord of the ocean. They were on par with the scattered demons, and no one could ignore them. "Night Elf, Irina is here." An announcement came from outside. Everyone turned to look at the door. Irina walked in slowly. She glanced around and sat down at the seat with her name written on it. Helena's face turned cold. She turned to look at Michael and said, "Castellan Michael, isn't this inappropriate? Irina and the Night Elves support the peace of the Nora continent and are willing to contribute to stopping the invasion of the undead army. It is reasonable for her to attend this meeting," Michael said calmly. Irina smiled at Helena. Her gaze paused on Sally for a while before she retracted it. Helena snorted coldly. However, the elves were on the decline, and today was not an occasion where she could just walk away. She could only express her stance and keep quiet. This last seems to have become stronger again? Dracula looked at Irina in shock and mumbled softly. He felt that she seemed to be a little different from before. Has she become stronger again? Camilla also couldn't help but sit up straight to make herself appear more gracious and appropriate. However, after glancing at Irina, she still felt that there was a huge gap between her and this woman. Big Sister Irina is still as beautiful and powerful as ever. Connie looked at Irina with admiration. Even though she was already known as the Queen of the Twilight Forest, she knew that she had only learned a little about Irina. The entire place was silent. There were 2 empty seats on Michael's right. Those belonged to the Roth Empire's representative team. There was also an empty seat beside Irina. It belonged to that man. The Roth Empire's representative team has arrived. Andre and the Empire's Marshal, Dominic, walked into the venue. Andre's gaze swept across the various representatives present. He paused at the empty seat beside Irina before he and Dominic sat beside Michael under the guidance of the staff. "Welcome, King Andre," Michael said with a smile. Sorry to have kept everyone waiting. Andre nodded slightly. He didn't look as arrogant as he did during the previous meeting. No one would have thought that the situation on the Norland continent would have such a drastic change in less than a month. Josh had pledged his loyalty to the devil, and the undead army had gathered in the extreme north under the devil's lead to head south. The arrogant Roth Empire could only tremble in fear in the face of the undead army and the devil. The peace agreement that had been rejected once appeared on the negotiating table again. The people sitting there were still the same group of people. However, this time, everyone already knew the outcome. Negotiations were no longer the goal. Everyone was concerned about how to deal with the undead army that threatened the entire Norland continent and the safety of all the races. Alex here. A man in black light armor walked in from the door. Chapter 2136. That man was here. Everyone's gaze turned to the door. Alex. This man who had once turned the tide outside Chaos City and sealed the devil that was about to break free and prevented a disaster. He was also the most powerful knight, or rather, the most powerful existence on the Norland continent in the past 10 years. The reason why all the races could gather in Chaos City so quickly had something to do with the photostone he brought back from the far north. It was hard to imagine what kind of tragic situation the unprepared races on the Norland continent would face if he hadn't discovered the existence of the devil and the undead army in advance. And his power might also be the only existence who had really broken through the 10th tier's upper limit in the past 1,000 years. The lightning tribulation that day was like the end of the world, and it had really shocked everyone. Guessing his power had also become the hottest topic among all the races recently. Without a doubt, Alex had already become an existence that could affect the situation on the Norland continent. Whether it was Irina, who followed him closely, or Lantist, who was obviously loyal to him, they couldn't be ignored. Meg sat down beside Irina and nodded at her. It wasn't that he was the latest to show off. It was just that he had chatted with the ladies for a while longer. Furthermore, he was punctual. It was just that these people had come too early. Meg scanned the people present. The various races' representatives were about the same as before, but only Connie's voice was left among the orcs. The Moon Nation's Great Formation Master, Jonas, was also present. He and Barbara were the Moon Nation's representatives for this meeting. The Moon Nation's Formation Masters played a huge role in sealing the half of Cthulhu outside Chaos City previously. This time, it was also Meg who asked Michael to ask for the Moon Nation's support. Cthulhu couldn't be killed. Meg was very clear about that. Even the Ancient Ones couldn't do it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have just sealed it again and not killed it directly. And the most hilarious person who set up the sealing spell formation was undoubtedly the Formation Master under Jonas' command. At this moment, Jonas was also looking at Meg. Their gazes met, and they nodded slightly at each other in greeting. Master, I know Sister Irina, and Alex is Irina's man, so I know Alex, Barbara whispered. Jonas glanced at her with a hint of a smile in his helplessness. Michael stood up and said in a clear voice, "Everyone is here. Let the peace conference begin." The new peace treaty is now in everyone's hands. The content is the same as the previous version, and it is also the same as the peace treaty we signed 100 years ago. However, in the Boundless Sea realm, there will be an area outside the Demon Islands that belongs to the Lantis tribe. The staff distributed a thick book of treaties to every participant at the round table. The representatives of the various clans were not in a hurry to express their opinions. Instead, they flipped through the details. This was related to the interests of the various clans. They could not afford to be careless. The Endless Sea realm is our private land. Why should we let them occupy it? Furthermore, it's not far from our Demon Islands. They might set their eyes on our territory one day. I don't agree, the chief of the Flaming Demons said angrily. That's right. A tribe that popped out of nowhere wants to encroach on our sea. The Abyss Demons chimed in, expressing their dissatisfaction with this clause. Camilla looked at the two of them and sarcastically said, although this is a tribe that popped out of nowhere, They are a powerful tribe with more than 10 10th-tier powerhouses and Alex as their backing. Furthermore, they are able to survive in the sea, so they have a unique racial advantage. If the undead army invades southward, Lantist, who can survive under the sea, will definitely be the tribe that will have the last laugh. Now that they are willing to join the ranks to fight against the undead army, they are only claiming a piece of the sea that they can survive in. What right do you think you have to object? Can you go into the sea and chase them away? The two chiefs were at a loss for words. They didn't know how to refute her words. The vampires have really chosen a terrible clan leader. At least Maynard has more courage and ambition than you. The chief of the flaming demons snorted through his nostrils. No, Maynard is too cowardly. That's why I removed him from the position. Dracula, who was slumped in the chair, sat up slowly. His gaze swept across the representatives of the top 10 demon tribes. This is the attitude of the vampires. It's better to have a friendly neighbor than a strong opponent. Furthermore, the other party doesn't even care about your small islands. The demons looked at each other. After a short discussion, the minority obeyed the majority. They reached a consensus and agreed to acknowledge the existence of Lantist. This was also a helpless move. After all, as Camilla said, no matter how dissatisfied they couldn't go to the endless ocean to fight Lantist. Furthermore, the other party was relying on Alex's golden thigh now. It was another matter whether they could win. Mag looked at Camilla with a slight smirk. This woman showed a rare side of her that was wise and far-sighted. The demons reached a consensus internally, which saved them some trouble. As for the battle for territory, the orcs had already lost their desire to fight for supremacy after the change of ownership. The Roth Empire was the first to face the threat of the undead army. They were still waiting for the other races to come to an agreement and send reinforcements. They had already lost the right to negotiate terms. There were a few races among the demons who were tempted to make a move, but they were already divided internally. Those few races couldn't do anything even if they wanted to. Hence, this treaty was basically agreed by all the races. It was something to be expected. Michael nodded and prepared to instruct for the signing ceremony. Wait a minute. Connie suddenly called out just then. Chief Connie, what do you have to say? Michael asked Connie. The orcs agree to sign this treaty, but before that, I have a condition that I need King Andre of the Roth Empire to agree to, Connie said to Andre. Everyone looked at Connie. The orcs and the Roth Empire had just gone through a terrible war. This kind of hatred couldn't be erased easily. Andre's expression also became serious. He sat up straight and looked at Connie. Please speak. Connie stood up slowly and said to Andre, although from the results of the investigation, it was Josh who led the war against the orcs in the Roth Empire after he sold his soul to the devil, this war has caused great damage to the orcs. However, this war has caused great losses to our beastmen. Dozens of tribes have been slaughtered in the war, and hundreds of thousands of beastmen have lost their lives. The Twilight Forest has been left in ruins. Before signing the new treaty, the orcs need the Roth Empire, which has not officially responded to this matter, to resolve the damage and losses that this war has caused to us orcs. Otherwise, the orcs will definitely not sign the treaty. We will use our own methods to avenge our dead tribesmen at all costs. Is Amy special today? Meg looked at Connie with a raised brow. He couldn't help but think. Chapter 2137. Connie's stance was very firm. If the Roth Empire didn't immediately respond to the invasion of the Twilight Forest and give appropriate compensation, perhaps the war between the orcs and the Roth Empire would happen earlier than the invasion of the undead army. This seemingly weak young lady's first target was the powerful Roth Empire after stabilizing her position as the great chief of the orcs. Of course, a woman who could kill Oster and take over the August tribe was naturally not to be underestimated. Everyone looked at Andre. As the king of the Roth Empire, he could make any decision on behalf of the Roth Empire. Everyone also thought of something else. If the orcs were under Oster's control now, then the orcs would be absent from this meeting today. Moreover, they would attack the Roth Empire at the same time as the meeting, paying blood for blood. In comparison, Connie was already considered a calm ruler. Meg looked at Connie with admiration. This lass's ability to control the situation was not bad. She could already control the situation without pulling any strings. Andre also stood up. He looked at Connie and nodded. I deeply regret and apologize to the orcs who died so tragically. This was caused by the devils. My son Josh lost his soul, and the families of my court officials were exterminated several times. From this, one can see how cruel and dangerous the devils are. Of course, the Roth Empire cannot shirk its responsibility for this. I am willing to apologize to the orcs on behalf of the Roth Empire, and I am also willing to make some compensation to comfort the dead orcs. However, I hope that the orcs can fight the devil and the undead army together with the Roth Empire to avenge the innocent orcs and protect the remaining orcs. This is a little overwhelming. Meg was a little shocked. Andre's words were very good at pushing the blame. Anyway, this had nothing to do with him or the Roth Empire. It was all the devil's fault. Because of the devil, he lost a son, a few officials, and a batch of brave soldiers. As a victim, he was willing to make some compensation to the other victim. But more importantly, the two victims should work together to fight the devil and take revenge together. Look, in just a few words, a war-persecuting country became a pitiful little country. Moreover, it was reasonable and hard to refute. In comparison, Connie's previous words were neither painful nor itchy, and even seemed a little unreasonable. Connie was slightly taken aback, and a hint of anger appeared on his face. In terms of negotiation skills and words, she was naturally far inferior to an old fox like Andre. It was only after she had communicated with him several times over the past 2 days that she was able to grasp the message so firmly. Now that Andre's words were neither light nor heavy, he had diverted the problem and cleared the responsibility. Clearly, he didn't want to take on too much responsibility. However, this was unacceptable to the beastmen. Although she was now the great chief of the orcs, she still had to seek justice for her dead tribesmen if she wanted to convince the masses, even if she didn't start a war with the Roth Empire. The devil is our common enemy, but the butchers who killed hundreds of thousands of orcs don't have any remorse now. Connie said in a low voice, "We only have 3 requests. First, hand over the generals of the 3 armies that invaded the Northwest in the previous war to us orcs. Second, compensate the orcs with a compensation of 1 million copper coins per person. Third, promise to hand Josh over to the orcs after we capture him." I can agree to the second and third request. Even with a compensation of 1 million copper coins per person, it will be difficult to compensate the innocent orcs who died tragically. As for Josh, who has lost his humanity and was manipulated by the devil to commit all these sins, I will also hand him over to the orcs for punishment. Andre nodded with a serious expression. However, the soldiers were following orders. Josh should be the one to bear the responsibility for this, and not the soldiers. This time, the Roth Empire will gather all the armies to go up north to stop the undead army. The Northwest Army will be the vanguard to go up north to fight for the Norland continent. Therefore, I can't agree to your request of punishing the soldiers. I hope you can understand. Connie looked at Andre and fell silent. The hall also became quiet. Both sides had their own standpoints, but they both hoped to stick to their positions. Meg frowned. It was understandable that Andre wanted to protect the soldiers of the Northwest Army. Just as he said, the soldiers were following orders. Being able to follow orders was a sign of strict military discipline. Fighting all the way to the August tribe also showed the strength of the Northwest Army. If Andre handed these soldiers over to the orcs to be punished, it would definitely chill the morale of the soldiers, and even cause the morale of the army to be unstable. Even if Josh was controlled by the devil, the second prince was the one who gave the order, and he was using the king's name. On this matter, Andre would definitely not give in. As for the orcs, they needed an outlet to vent their accumulated anger. If Connie couldn't balance the internal conflict, her position as chief would be unstable. It was a difficult stalemate. However, this was also within his expectations. However, they didn't have much time left. She had sent him the news of Cthulhu and the undead armies gathering last night. The undead armies' numbers were increasing rapidly, and it was obvious that they were gathering. They might be heading south soon. If the orcs and the Roth Empire continued to argue about the war reparations, causing the peace treaty to be unable to be signed, the undead army might have already headed south while they were still in the meeting. Meg stood up and looked at Connie and Andre. He said in a low voice, "Once the undead army heads south, we will have to sacrifice a lot of lives to stop them. This number will far exceed the number of people who died in the conflicts and wars between the different races in the past 100 years. We don't have much time left, so I hope that both of you can put aside your hatred for the time being and focus on the war that we are about to face. I know you have seen the photo stone, but you might not know how powerful that devil is because you haven't really seen it. But you've all seen the devil that was sealed outside Chaos City. The devil that escaped the seal is even stronger. At the very least, I don't have any chance of winning against it. I don't even have the confidence to fight it and buy time for the spell formation masters. As for the million-strong undead army, they don't feel pain and have no life. They don't fear death, they don't know fatigue, and they don't need to be replenished. If we want to stop them from heading south at the border of the icy plains, we will have to pay a terrible price. The number of orcs who died is not just a number." Connie looked at Meg. Meg nodded and said, "I know, but if we don't react quickly, there will be more families who will lose their husbands, children, and even everyone." Chapter 2138. Connie pursed his lips and pondered in silence. Andre looked at Meg in surprise. He didn't expect him to speak up for the Roth Empire at this time. Michael nodded slightly. He was also thinking about how to mediate the conflict between the two parties so that the peace treaty could be signed as soon as possible. Meg's words were more convincing than his. "I agree with Alex very much. The most important thing now is to get rid of the devils and the undead army. If the entire Norland continent falls, the gains and losses of every city and lake will be meaningless. Chief Connie, I will get the Minister of the Interior to arrange for the payment of the war compensation as soon as possible. Please give those soldiers a chance to bathe in blood and kill the enemy," Andre said sincerely to Connie. Connie looked at Rex instinctively. Alex's intervention made her feel a little lost. That may be the case, but there are indeed some scum in the Northwest Army who should take responsibility for their crimes. "Isn't that right, Marshal?" Mag asked again. This time, he was looking at Dominic, who was sitting beside Andre. A knight's code of conduct is to not harm innocent women and children. This is also the bottom line of a human being. No matter which officer gave such an inhumane order, as a knight, he should respect his own beliefs and principles. As for those generals who forced the soldiers to kill the captives, burn and pillage, shouldn't they be cleared out to apologize to those innocent souls who died unjustly? What right do they have to die on the battlefield like warriors? Are they worthy? Andre's lips moved. He glanced at Dominic, but he still chose to remain silent. Dominic saw that Andre didn't say anything, so he could only stand up. After a moment of silence, he nodded and said, "They are indeed not worthy to be called knights, and not worthy to die on the battlefield as warriors." Meg nodded and sat down. Dominic looked at Andre and said, "Your Majesty, please allow me to clear out the scumbags in the army. They are not worthy to stay in the army, and are not worthy to be called knights." Andre said in a low voice, "All right. After clearing out these people, inform the whole army, and let the orcs deal with them." "Great Chief Connie, what do you think about this?" Andre asked Connie. "If you can keep your word, I agree with this solution." Connie nodded, and his expression relaxed. In the end, Alex still gave the beastmen face and a way out. This was the result that she had expected. Not bad. Irina looked at Meg and transmitted her voice. The corners of Meg's mouth curled up slightly, but he remained calm. Actually, the outcome was the same. It was just that Meg had given the Roth Empire a legitimate reason to get rid of some of the scum in the army. And in the Northwest Army, most of these dregs belong to Sean. Look, this is another brilliant plan that kills two birds with one stone. The conflict between the Orcs and the Roth Empire was resolved, and the signing of the peace treaty became much smoother. Connie and Andre signed a mediation agreement on the spot, and both parties confirmed the matter that they had discussed previously. The Roth Empire would hand over some of the war criminals to the Orcs, and pay a huge sum of war compensation. They also promised to hand Josh over to the Orcs if they could capture him. After that, the various representatives had a discussion about some of the details of the peace treaty. After some amendments, the final version was finalized. The various representatives all signed the new peace treaty. 100 years of peace has begun again. Everyone here is very impressive, Michael said emotionally as he looked at the various representatives present. Chaos City had worked hard for decades for this moment. They didn't expect to renew the peace treaty under such circumstances. The series of complicated processes only ended when the sun was setting. As a witness, Mag was also an unimportant bystander. He even made time to go home to cook dinner for the children, and had a few drinks with Irina before returning to the venue at night. Now that the peace treaty had been signed, they naturally had to discuss how to form an allied army to go up north to fight against the undead army. According to the latest news, the undead army has reached 1 million people. There are many terrifying ancient corpses among them. I'm afraid they are as powerful as 10th tier powerhouses. There are also powerhouses like Rankster who have surpassed 10th tier, and even more powerful devils. Meg looked at everyone with a serious expression, and said, "We need to form a sufficiently strong allied army to be confident of stopping the undead army in the extreme north." 1 million people? The various representatives were in an uproar when they heard that. This was far beyond everyone's expectations. Is the source reliable? Lewis looked at Meg solemnly. "I went to the north last night. The ancient corpses are gathering on the ice field. There are more than 1 million of them, and they could come south at any time." Mag took out a photo stone and played the image that she sent him yesterday. The densely packed ancient corpses almost covered the entire ice field, and one couldn't see the end of it. They were all gathering in one direction with a clear goal, as if they were summoned by something. The various representatives had serious expressions. Alex wouldn't lie about such things. Besides, this photo stone image was very convincing. What did 1 million-strong army mean? On the Norland continent, only the Roth Empire, which had thrived for 100 years, had 1 million-strong army. Unless all the other races were soldiers, it was very difficult to form 1 million-strong army. Furthermore, the logistical personnel needed to support 1 million-strong army would exceed 1 million people. It wasn't something that any race could bear easily. However, the other party was an undead army. They were ancient corpses that had been dead for thousands of years. They were driven by the devil and didn't need logistical support. They moved in unison and weren't afraid of death. How could they play this game? The representatives who wanted to make up the numbers were a little confused now. There were even some who wanted to avoid it. Andre frowned slightly. The various representatives had their own thoughts. If they weren't willing to send out their elites to help, the Roth Empire would be in danger. The Roth Empire will send out all our elite troops, a total of 600,000 soldiers and magic casters, to the north to fight against the undead army. We will also be responsible for most of the logistical support for the allied army, Andre said loudly. This concerns the safety of the Norland continent. I hope everyone can step forward. Meg nodded slightly. 600,000 elites and the allied army's logistical support. Andre had almost taken out all the assets of the Roth Empire. He was quite sincere. However, there was no other choice. The Roth Empire was the first to bear the brunt. If the Roth Empire wasn't sincere, they couldn't expect the various races to send their elites to join the allied army. Michael then said loudly, "Chaos City is willing to send 30,000 of our most elite guards to join the allied army to fight against the undead army. We will also be responsible for all the logistical support." Chapter 2139. Chaos City was one of the weaker races. They only had about 40,000 guards, and they were sending out 30,000 elites. This time, They were showing their sincerity. Michael knew the severity of this crisis. After a few internal meetings in Chaos City, they finally decided on this number. Lewis said in a low voice, "The giant dragons will send out 8,000 giant dragons to support this battle. 8,000 giant dragons." Meg's eyes lit up. This was a true aerial attack ability. Giant dragons all had long-range attacks, and most of them were area of effect skills. They could suppress the undead army in the air. The number of giant dragons was the least among all the races on the Norland continent. 8,000 giant dragons were basically the core power of the giant dragons. It seemed like the giant dragons were still very concerned about the demons leaving Giant Dragon Island. Soon after, all the other races also expressed their stance. Lantist would send out 10,000 soldiers to join the allied army. Only Meg knew that this was Lantist's full combat power without any reservations. The goblins would send out 5,000 goblin warriors and 10,000 logistics elites to be in charge of logistics. The goblins were known for their strong logistical and planning abilities. After all, they were able to live in a complex underground cave, yet they were still able to keep the entire race in order and produce the most minerals in the entire continent. They still had racial talents. The trolls would send out 10,000 troll warriors and 20,000 logistics trolls to be in charge of transporting the snowfield. The dwarves would send out 5,000 dwarven warriors to be in charge of the repair of the allied army's weapons and construction. They were very outstanding tools. The orcs would send out 200,000 orc warriors to join the allied army. As a powerful race that could challenge the Roth Empire, the orcs also had a huge number of tribal warriors. However, the orcs had made a request that the Roth Empire had to be in charge of all the logistics for the orcs. Andre had already agreed to this request on the spot. All the races had already expressed their stance. Only the elves and demons had yet to express their stance. Everyone looked at Helena and the representatives of the demons. It was indeed not easy to make a decision between the scattered demons and the divided elves. Helena was not in a hurry to express her stance. Instead, she looked at Irina and asked, "How many night elves will go to the battlefield?" Irina calmly said, "I've already sent out the notice to join the battle. Currently, there are 3,500 elves who meet the requirements to join Chaos City's army. 1,000 of them will be warriors, while 2,500 will be in charge of healing and logistics." "Very good. In this aspect, you are very much like Her Majesty." Helena nodded before announcing in a clear voice, "The elven race will dispatch 20,000 elven warriors and 10,000 healers. They will be responsible for their own logistics." Meg looked at Helena in surprise. The wind forest wasn't very harmonious right now. He originally thought that Helena would leave most of her main forces in the wind forest to guard against any unexpected changes, but she sent out almost all of her elite forces. After Helena expressed her stance, all of the representatives turned toward the representatives of the 10 major demon tribes. Because there wasn't a single powerful race that could convince the masses, and the previous alliance had collapsed due to internal strife, the current demon race didn't have a unified voice at all, nor did they have someone who could speak for them. Since the situation is already like this, let's gather together. Before we came, I'm sure all of you know how many people you can send, and how many people your affiliated races can send. Dracula put down the wine glass in his hand, and smilingly said, "The vampires can send 1,000 people." Given the number of vampires, 1,000 vampires was already a huge sum. Since all the races are here to protect the Norland continent, let's not hide anymore. If we can't stop them, we might be even more cowardly in the future. The leader of the spatial demons slammed the table and said, "The spatial demons and the affiliated demons can send 10,000 warriors." After the vampires and spatial demons expressed their stance one after another, the other demon tribes couldn't hide anymore, and also expressed their stance one after another. Apart from the flaming demons and abyss demons who had exhausted themselves in the previous civil war, and were still wary, the other demon tribes were quite sincere. In the end, the Demon Islands sent out 100,000 soldiers, which was second only to the Roth Empire and the Orcs. Great. In this way, all the races on the Norland continent will also have 1 million strong soldiers. We will definitely not be at a disadvantage in the battle against the devil's 1 million undead army. Andrei clapped his hands and cheered. All the races were already very sincere about sending out their troops. It had even far exceeded Andrei's expectations. This lineup and specifications represented the strongest combat power on the Norland continent at the moment. 100 years ago, all the races were at war. 100 years later, all the races had to fight side by side against the devils. The representatives of the various races also smiled. When they heard Meg mention the 1 million undead army, they were indeed a little shocked. But now that all the races had sent out their troops and formed an unprecedentedly strong army, they finally felt the courage to fight. Michael stood up and loudly said, "The joint army has been formed." But for such a huge army from all the races to be fully effective on the battlefield, we have to decide tonight how we should command and who should be in charge. A plate of loose sand will only end up as the side that gets slaughtered on the battlefield. After Michael said that, the representatives of the various races fell silent for a short while before they started discussing. Command? The warriors of the Abyss race only listen to my commands. I don't want to listen to anyone's commands and lose my life for nothing, the Abyss Demon Chief said with a cold smile. The Flaming Tribe won't listen to anyone's commands either. Isn't it just killing undead? One fireball to burn a bunch of them. Do we still need to command? I'm afraid it's not easy to choose a commander. If we choose a biased one, he will definitely protect his own people and send the other races to the front line, Helena said with an underlying meaning. War is not child's play. A war with 1 million elites is also a rich war that no one has fought before. Who can take on this responsibility? Lewis asked with a frown. In the loose alliance that had just been formed, the interests of all the races were related. It was obviously not realistic to want to immediately choose a commander who could convince the masses. The giant dragons were rather prestigious, but giant dragons had always relied on their strength to suppress their opponents in the air. How could they have a military talent who could command and control an army of 1 million? Moreover, once they decided who the commander was, it meant that the commander had the right to deploy all the races. The representatives of the various races naturally had some thoughts. Seeing that everyone was noisy, Michael also loudly said, "The various races have formed a powerful alliance. If there is no one who can command them and use good steel on the blade, we have no chance of winning. I think we should use voting to choose a fair and convincing commander so that the alliance can become more efficient and powerful to deal with the attacks of the devils and undead army." You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.